Some people are not meant to stay. They are meant to wake you up. They enter your life like a blessing, touch places inside you that were sleeping, then leave in a way that makes you question everything. At first, you may call it loss, betrayal, rejection, or abandonment. But what if it was something deeper? What if their leaving was not the end of your peace, but the beginning of your awakening? You were told that real love always stays, that deep connections are supposed to last forever, and that if someone leaves, it means you were not enough. But if that were true, why do some people hurt you and still teach you? Why do some goodbyes break your heart but open your eyes? Why do some endings make you lose the person, yet find yourself? The truth is, some people come into your life only long enough to show you where you are still attached, where you are still afraid, and where you are still begging to be chosen by someone who was never meant to become your home. Buddhist teachings remind us that suffering begins when we cling to what life is already asking us to release. Tonight, as you listen to these teachings, something inside you will begin to loosen. The pain you have been holding will start to soften. The memories will stop feeling like chains, and the people you lost will no longer look like proof that you were abandoned. They will begin to look like mirrors, messengers, and awakenings sent to guide you back to yourself. This is not just a lesson about letting go. This is a transformation in how you understand love, loss, attachment, and the people who were never meant to stay. Are you ready? Let's begin. Some of the greatest pain in life does not come from losing people. It comes from realizing they were never meant to stay in the first place. And the hardest part is that the soul usually understands this long before the mind accepts it. That is why some connections leave behind confusion instead of closure, because they were never designed to complete your life. They were designed to wake up a part of you that had been sleeping for years. There is a quiet sadness that many people carry without fully understanding it. It is the sadness of trying to hold on to people who were only meant to pass through their lives like seasons. Some arrive to teach strength. Some arrive to expose insecurity. Some arrive to reveal how deeply you feared abandonment. Others arrive to show how much of yourself you were willing to sacrifice just to avoid being alone. But because the connection felt intense, emotional, and life-changing, you believed it was supposed to last forever. A painful truth that Buddhism teaches is that not every meaningful connection is permanent. Some souls enter your life for a very short period of time, yet leave behind lessons powerful enough to transform your entire future. The suffering begins when you mistake temporary purpose for permanent belonging. There are people who enter your life almost like mirrors. At first, they feel comforting, familiar, exciting. You feel seen by them in a way you have not felt before. You start believing they understand you completely, but slowly, without realizing it, they begin exposing hidden wounds inside you that were buried for years. Wounds you did not know were controlling your emotions, your fears, your relationships, and your sense of worth. Sometimes a person enters your life and suddenly you become afraid of being abandoned. Not because they created the fear, but because they awakened a fear that was already living quietly inside you. Before meeting them, you may have thought you were emotionally strong, independent, healed. Then one change in their energy, one delayed message, one moment of distance, and suddenly anxiety begins controlling your mind. You overthink, you panic, you seek reassurance. You start losing peace over someone else's attention. That moment is painful, but spiritually important, because the person did not create the wound. They revealed it. Many people spend their entire lives believing they are healed simply because life never tested their hidden pain deeply enough. Then one relationship suddenly exposes everything. Childhood abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, fear of being replaced. fear of being forgotten. And because the emotional exposure feels overwhelming, they blame the person completely without realizing something deeper is happening. Buddhist teachings often remind us that suffering becomes a doorway to awareness when we stop running from what it reveals. The problem is that most people become obsessed with keeping the person instead of understanding the lesson. They focus so much on getting the relationship back that they never ask why losing it shattered them so deeply in the first place. Temporary souls often enter your life to interrupt illusions you have been living under for years. Some people expose the illusion that your worth depends on being chosen. Others expose the illusion that love means sacrificing your peace. Some reveal how much validation you secretly seek from others. Some expose your emotional dependency. Others reveal your habit of ignoring red flags because you fear loneliness more than suffering. And the painful part is that these lessons rarely arrive gently. Life usually sends awakening through discomfort because comfort keeps people asleep. When everything feels safe and predictable, most people never question themselves deeply. They continue repeating unconscious patterns for years. But when a painful relationship shakes your emotional world, suddenly you begin seeing yourself clearly. You begin noticing how much of your happiness was attached to another person's behavior. You notice how easily your mood changes depending on whether someone texts you back or gives you attention. You begin realizing that what you called love was sometimes fear mixed with attachment. That realization hurts because the ego wants to believe every emotional connection is destiny. The ego wants permanence. It wants guarantees. It wants people to remain exactly as they were when they first made you feel special. But Buddhism teaches that everything changes. People change, feelings change, relationships change, life itself changes every moment. Trying to freeze life into permanence is like trying to hold water tightly in your hands. The harder you squeeze, the faster it disappears. There are also temporary souls who enter your life not to hurt you, but to awaken qualities inside you that comfort never could. Some people unknowingly awaken your courage. Some awaken your creativity. Some awaken your spiritual side. Some push you toward purpose after years of emotional numbness. And strangely enough, many of these people leave before you fully understand why they entered your life at all. At first, their departure feels cruel. You replay memories endlessly. You wonder what changed. You search for explanations. You blame yourself. But years later, you suddenly realize that meeting them changed the entire direction of your life. Maybe losing them forced you to finally respect yourself. Maybe they inspired you to grow emotionally. Maybe the pain pushed you into spirituality, healing, discipline, or self-awareness. Maybe before meeting them, you were living half asleep emotionally, repeating the same unconscious routines every day. Some souls do not come to stay. They come to activate transformation. One of the deepest forms of suffering happens when people try turning temporary souls into permanent ones. This is where attachment becomes dangerous. Instead of appreciating the lesson, they begin clinging to the person. They try to force consistency where life is already creating distance. They ignore signs. They abandon intuition. They overextend themselves emotionally, trying to keep someone who is naturally drifting away. And slowly, they begin betraying themselves. They tolerate disrespect they once promised themselves they would never accept. They shrink their personality to avoid conflict. They become emotionally exhausted trying to maintain a connection that no longer flows naturally. All because they believe letting go means failure. But Buddhism teaches something very different. It teaches that attachment creates suffering because it demands permanence from temporary experiences. This does not mean you should stop loving people. It means you should stop trying to possess them emotionally. There is a difference between loving someone and believing your emotional survival depends on their presence. That difference changes everything. Temporary souls also reveal emotional blindness. Sometimes you think you are choosing people consciously, but in reality, you are unconsciously repeating familiar emotional patterns. You keep attracting emotionally unavailable people because chaos feels familiar. You chase people who withdraw because part of you learned early in life that love must be earned through suffering. You become attached to inconsistency because your nervous system mistakes unpredictability for emotional intensity, until one painful connection finally forces you to notice the pattern. And once awareness enters, life can never feel the same again. This is why awakening often feels lonely at first, because awareness changes what you can tolerate emotionally. Suddenly, certain relationships no longer feel healthy, certain conversations no longer interest you, certain behaviors no longer feel normal. What once felt exciting now feels draining. What once felt like love now feels like emotional. Survival. Temporary souls often leave behind permanent awareness. There is also a spiritual reason why some people disappear suddenly. Sometimes life removes people quickly because their purpose has already been completed. The lesson has been delivered. The illusion has been exposed. The awakening has begun. Keeping them longer would only deepen attachment and delay growth. But the human mind struggles to accept this because it always wants explanations. It wants closure. It wants certainty. Yet many awakenings happen without complete answers. Sometimes silence becomes the lesson. Sometimes unanswered questions force you inward instead of outward. Instead of obsessing over another person's reasons, you begin exploring your own wounds, your own attachments, your own fears, and that inner exploration becomes the beginning of wisdom. One of the hardest things to accept is that not every connection is meant to become a lifelong story. Some are only a chapter, beautiful, painful, transformative, temporary, and there is nothing wrong with that. A flower does not fail because it blooms briefly. A sunset does not become meaningless because it disappears at night. Some things exist to awaken feeling, awareness, beauty, and transformation for a moment. Human connections can be the same. The suffering begins when you demand eternity from experiences that were only meant to touch your soul temporarily. Many people spend years angry at those who left them without realizing those same people helped shape their emotional awakening. This does not mean every painful person deserves gratitude for harmful behavior. It simply means that sometimes growth hides inside experiences you never would have chosen willingly. Pain has a strange way of exposing truth. It reveals where you are emotionally dependent. It reveals what controls your peace. It reveals what you fear losing most. And once you see those truths clearly, healing can finally begin. That is why Buddhist wisdom does not teach emotional numbness. It teaches awareness. It teaches learning how to love deeply without losing yourself inside attachment. It teaches understanding that people can matter greatly and still not remain forever. And perhaps one of the most peaceful realizations in life is understanding this. Just because someone left does not mean the connection was meaningless. Some people complete their purpose in your life long before your heart is ready to let them go. In time, you begin seeing things differently. You stop viewing every ending as punishment. You stop believing abandonment defines your worth. You stop measuring love by duration alone. Instead, you begin asking different questions. What did this connection awaken inside me? What illusion did it expose? What pain did it reveal? What awareness did it leave behind? Those questions create healing, because eventually you realize that some people were never sent to walk beside you forever. They were sent to wake up the parts of you that could no longer stay asleep. And once you understand that some people were only meant to wake you up, another painful truth begins to appear. Sometimes the suffering does not come from the person leaving. Sometimes the suffering comes from you trying to keep a connection alive after its season has already ended. The heart keeps reaching backward, the mind keeps rewriting the story, and the soul quietly knows that something has already expired. There is a kind of pain that does not come from losing love, but from forcing what no longer has life to pretend it is still alive. Some relationships do not end suddenly. They begin fading long before anyone says goodbye. The conversations become thinner, the warmth becomes weaker, the laughter feels less natural, the effort becomes uneven. One person starts holding the entire connection like a heavy bucket with a hole at the bottom, pouring more love in, more patience in, more forgiveness in, more hope in, yet everything keeps leaking out. And because attachment does not want truth, it calls this loyalty. It says, try harder. It says, maybe they will change. It says, maybe if you love them enough, they will become who they used to be. It says, maybe if you become quieter, softer, easier, more forgiving, less emotional, less needy, less yourself, they will stay. But Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when the mind refuses to accept change. Not because change is cruel, but because clinging turns change into torture. A relationship can complete its natural purpose, but attachment will still drag it forward like a dead branch, hoping it will bloom again. And this is where emotional decay begins. At first, you do not notice it. You tell yourself every relationship has difficult seasons. You remind yourself of the good memories. You replay the beginning, when everything felt alive, when their attention felt steady, when their presence felt like safety. You keep loving the version of them that made you feel chosen, even while the version standing in front of you now keeps making you feel small. This is how people get trapped. They do not stay because the present is peaceful. They stay because the past was beautiful. But the past can become a cage when you keep using it to excuse what is hurting you now. An expired connection is not always full of hatred. Sometimes it is full of history. That is what makes it difficult. If someone was completely terrible from the beginning, leaving would be easier. But when someone once made you feel loved, seen, understood, and safe, your mind keeps returning to that version of them like a hungry person returning to an empty kitchen. You keep hoping the meal will appear again. You keep hoping the warmth will return. You keep hoping the person who once held your heart gently will come back inside the same body. But sometimes people do not return to who they were. Sometimes the connection has already changed form, and what you are holding is no longer love. It is memory wearing love's clothing. Buddhist wisdom asks us to look deeply, not at what we want something to be, but at what it truly is. This kind of seeing is painful because it removes the fantasy. It asks you to stop decorating the truth. It asks you to stop calling neglect a rough phase. It asks you to stop calling emotional hunger patience. It asks you to stop calling self-abandonment devotion. Because when a connection has expired, your soul begins to feel it before your mouth can admit it. You feel tired after speaking to them. You feel anxious when waiting for them. You feel lonely even when they are close. You feel like you must carefully manage your words to avoid distance, silence, anger, or rejection. You feel yourself shrinking, but you keep telling yourself that love requires sacrifice. Love may require patience, but it should not require the slow disappearance of your spirit. There is a big difference between a relationship going through difficulty and a relationship losing its life. Difficulty can still have honesty inside it. It can still have mutual care. It can still have two people trying, repairing, listening, and growing. But an expired connection feels different. It feels like one person is watering a plant whose roots have already died. You can keep pouring water, but the leaves will not return. This is where many people suffer for years. They are not grieving an ending. They are living inside an ending that they refuse to name. And because they refuse to name it, the pain repeats every day. They wake up hoping today will feel different. They check their phone, hoping the message will sound warmer. They enter conversations hoping the old closeness will return. They accept crumbs and try to convince themselves they are being fed. One kind word becomes enough to erase 10 moments of emotional absence. One apology becomes enough to ignore a repeated pattern. One memory becomes enough to keep them trapped in a reality that keeps wounding them. Attachment is powerful because it does not always look like weakness. Sometimes it looks like endurance. Sometimes it looks like faith. Sometimes it looks like being the bigger person. But underneath, it may simply be fear wearing a noble mask. Fear of starting again. Fear of being alone. Fear of admitting you gave so much to something that could not hold you. Fear of discovering that the person you were trying to save was also the person slowly draining you. Buddhism does not ask you to hate what has ended. It asks you to stop clinging to it as if your life depends on it. This is important because many people believe detachment means becoming cold. But detachment is not coldness. Detachment is honesty without possession. It is the ability to love what was, accept what is, and stop forcing what no longer wants to grow. There is deep peace in learning to stop arguing with reality. When a connection has reached its natural ending, reality begins speaking in small ways before it shouts. It speaks through your body becoming tense around them. It speaks through your constant overthinking. It speaks through the heaviness you feel after every interaction. It speaks through the way your joy slowly becomes dependent on their mood. It speaks through the quiet voice inside you that keeps whispering, "This is not the same anymore." But attachment tells you not to listen. Attachment says, maybe you are overreacting. It says, maybe you are too sensitive. It says, maybe you should give it more time. And yes, some situations need patience, but patience without truth becomes self-harm. Waiting without wisdom becomes emotional imprisonment. The Buddhist path teaches awareness. Awareness means seeing clearly, not seeing through anger, not seeing through fantasy, not seeing through desperation, seeing clearly. And when you see clearly, you begin to notice that some relationships are not being kept alive by love anymore. They are being kept alive by fear, habit, guilt, nostalgia, and the pain of letting go. Habit is one of the strongest chains. You get used to someone being part of your day, your thoughts, your plans, your identity. Even when they hurt you, their presence feels familiar. Even when the relationship brings anxiety, your nervous system recognizes the pattern and calls it normal. This is why many people return to connections that break them. Not because it is healthy, but because it is known. The unknown feels frightening, even when it contains freedom. So people remain in expired connections because the pain is familiar. They know how to survive it. They know how to wait. They know how to forgive. They know how to lower their expectations. They know how to cry quietly and still answer kindly. They know how to pretend they are okay. But they do not yet know who they are without the suffering. That is the deeper fear. Sometimes you do not cling to a person because they are good for you. You cling because without them, you would have to meet the empty places inside yourself. You would have to face the silence. You would have to rebuild your identity. You would have to ask, who am I when I am no longer trying to be chosen? That question can feel terrifying, but it is also the beginning of freedom, because an expired connection takes more than your peace. It takes your attention. It takes your energy. It takes your ability to be present. It pulls you out of your own life and places you inside constant emotional negotiation. You are always measuring. Are they distant today? Are they warm today? Did I say too much? Did I ask for too much? Are they pulling away? Should I pull back too? Should I act like I do not care? This is not love. This is emotional survival. And the sad thing is, the longer you remain in this state, the more you forget what peace feels like. Chaos begins to feel normal. Anxiety begins to feel like passion. Inconsistency begins to feel like mystery. Silence begins to feel like punishment. Small affection begins to feel like a miracle. That is emotional decay. It does not always happen loudly. It happens slowly. You stop laughing the same way. You stop trusting your own feelings. You stop speaking honestly because honesty might create distance. You stop asking for what you need because you are afraid the answer will confirm what you already know. You begin choosing the relationship over your own inner safety. And every time you betray your truth to keep someone close, something inside you becomes weaker. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering because clinging is a refusal to let life move. Everything in life has movement. Breath comes and goes. Seasons come and go. Emotions rise and fade. People enter, change, and sometimes leave. When you accept this movement, pain may still come, but it does not become prison. When you resist it, pain becomes identity. You begin saying, "I cannot live without them." But that is not love speaking. That is attachment forgetting your own strength. You lived before they arrived. You breathed before they chose you. You had a soul before their attention touched it. Their presence may have awakened something in you, but it did not create your worth. This is what attachment makes you forget. It makes one person feel like the source of your life when they were only a visitor inside it. And when a visitor's time is over, keeping them locked inside your heart becomes suffering for both of you. There are connections that become heavy because their purpose has already been fulfilled. Maybe they came to teach you confidence. Maybe they came to show you your abandonment wound. Maybe they came to reveal your lack of boundaries. Maybe they came to show you that chemistry without peace is not love. But once the lesson has arrived, the soul starts preparing to move forward. The mind, however, keeps asking for more. More time, more signs, more explanations, more chances, more proof that the story is not finished. But sometimes the story is finished, and your pain is not proof that you should stay. Sometimes your pain is proof that you stayed past the ending. This is a hard truth, but a healing one. Because the moment you realize you are suffering not from love, but from forcing permanence, you begin to recover your power. You stop asking, "How do I make them stay?" and start asking, "Why am I holding on to what keeps hurting me?" That one question can change your life. It brings the focus back to you, not in a selfish way, but in an awakened way. Because as long as your entire mind is focused on keeping someone, you cannot see what the attachment is doing to your spirit. You cannot see how much peace you have traded for hope. You cannot see how much truth you have ignored to protect a fantasy. And fantasy is one of attachment's favorite hiding places. Fantasy says, "One day they will understand." Fantasy says, "One day they will love me properly." Fantasy says, "One day all this pain will be worth it." But Buddhist wisdom gently asks, what is happening now? Not what could happen if they changed. Not what might happen if they healed. Not what you wish they would become. What is happening now? Are you peaceful now? Are you respected now? Are you growing now? Are you becoming more yourself or less? The present moment is where truth lives. Attachment lives in the past and future. It uses the past to remind you of what once felt beautiful, and it uses the future to promise what might become beautiful again. But the present shows you the reality you keep avoiding, and if the present keeps hurting you, you must pay attention. This does not mean leaving everything the moment it becomes hard. It means learning the difference between a living connection that needs care and an expired connection that needs release. A living connection may struggle, but it still breathes. There is still effort, there is still respect, there is still repair, there is still emotional honesty. There is still a willingness from both sides. An expired connection survives mostly on memory, fear, and one-sided effort, and one-sided effort eventually becomes resentment. You may begin as the patient one, the forgiving one, the understanding one. But over time, your kindness becomes tired. Your compassion becomes mixed with bitterness. You start resenting them for not meeting you where you are, while secretly resenting yourself for staying where you are not valued. This is why forcing permanence creates emotional decay. It turns love into pressure. It turns care into control. It turns hope into obsession. It turns patience into self-neglect. It turns memories into chains. And the longer you force it, the harder it becomes to leave without anger. That is why Buddhism encourages letting go before the heart becomes poisoned. Release does not have to be dramatic. It does not have to be full of hatred. Sometimes release begins quietly. It begins when you stop chasing. It begins when you stop explaining your worth. It begins when you stop trying to revive conversations that keep dying. It begins when you stop using your soul as glue for something life has already separated. There is dignity in knowing when to stop pouring yourself into what no longer receives you. But dignity often returns slowly. At first, letting go may feel like losing. It may feel like giving up. It may feel like failure. That is because the ego measures love by how long you can hold on. But wisdom measures love by whether holding on still brings truth, peace, and growth. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop forcing a connection to be what it no longer is. And this does not erase the beauty that existed. That is important. Letting go does not mean the connection was fake. It does not mean the memories were meaningless. It does not mean you were foolish for loving them. It simply means the season has changed. A season can be real and still end. Rain can be needed and still stop. A person can be important and still not be meant to continue with you. When you understand this, your heart becomes softer, not harder. You stop needing to hate people in order to release them. You stop needing to destroy the memory in order to accept the ending. You allow the connection to be what it was without forcing it to become what it cannot be. That is maturity. That is detachment. That is peace beginning to return. The suffering created by trying to keep expired connections is not just emotional. It can affect your entire life. Your focus weakens, your sleep changes, your motivation fades, your body carries tension, your creativity dries up, your friendships suffer because your mind is always somewhere else. You become physically present in your life, but emotionally trapped in someone else's absence. This is why attachment can become a quiet thief. It steals your days while promising a future that may never arrive. It steals your confidence while telling you to wait for reassurance. It steals your clarity while feeding you confusion. It steals your self-respect while calling it love. And then one day, you look in the mirror and realize you have become tired in a way sleep cannot fix. That tiredness is often the soul, begging for release. Not because you stopped caring, but because caring has become a cage. And no love that cages your spirit can lead you to peace. Buddhist teachings do not tell you to close your heart. They teach you to open your eyes. Open your eyes to impermanence. Open your eyes to patterns. Open your eyes to the cost of clinging. Open your eyes to the quiet ways you abandon yourself when you are terrified of being abandoned by someone else. Because sometimes the person you are most afraid to lose has already lost you to anxiety, waiting, and emotional exhaustion. You may still be near them, but you are no longer near yourself. And coming back to yourself is the real beginning of detachment. Detachment does not always begin with a goodbye. Sometimes it begins with a deep breath and one honest sentence. This is hurting me more than it is helping me. That sentence may not end the connection immediately, but it ends the illusion. It brings your awareness back. It reminds you that your peace matters too. From there, you begin to stop forcing. You stop pulling on doors that only open from the other side. You stop begging for warmth from someone who keeps choosing distance. You stop dragging the past into the present and calling it hope. You stop confusing loyalty with staying where your soul is slowly becoming numb. And slowly the emotional decay begins to reverse. You feel small pieces of yourself returning. Your mind becomes clearer. Your body becomes lighter. Your spirit begins to breathe again. You may still miss them, but missing them no longer controls you. You may still love them, but love no longer means losing yourself. This is the quiet miracle of release. Not that you forget the person, but that you remember yourself. And once you remember yourself, you begin to understand why some connections had to expire. Not because they were worthless, but because they were complete. Their purpose had been served. Their lesson had been delivered. Their season had ended. The only thing left was your willingness to stop dragging what was already gone. Because some relationships become painful, not because they were never meaningful, but because you kept them beyond their natural ending. You tried to turn a lesson into a lifetime. You tried to turn a season into a home. You tried to turn a temporary soul into a permanent shelter. And Buddhism gently brings you back to the truth. Everything that begins will change. Everything that changes asks for awareness. Everything that ends asks for release. And everything you release with wisdom makes room for peace. So if there is a connection in your life that feels heavy, one that keeps asking you to abandon yourself just to keep it breathing, pause and listen deeply, not to fear, not to fantasy, not to memory. Listen to the quiet knowing beneath all of it. Your soul already knows what has expired, and the moment you stop forcing permanence, suffering begins to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not always easily, but gently, slowly, honestly. You begin to see that letting go is not the death of love. Sometimes it is the rescue of your own life, and perhaps that is the hardest part to accept. Some connections do not end because love was fake. They end because the lesson has already been completed. The suffering only deepens when you keep dragging something your soul has already outgrown. But once you stop forcing people to stay, another truth slowly begins to reveal itself. Sometimes being left behind becomes the very thing that finally brings you back to yourself. There is a certain kind of silence that arrives after abandonment, and at first it feels unbearable. The phone becomes quieter. The conversations disappear, the routines collapse. The person you once looked for is suddenly gone, and your mind keeps reaching toward an absence that no longer responds. It feels like standing in the middle of an emotional earthquake after everything familiar has fallen apart. In those moments, many people believe they are only experiencing loss, but hidden underneath that pain is something much deeper. There is an awakening beginning quietly inside them, because sometimes abandonment does what comfort never could. It forces you to finally meet yourself without distraction. When people feel emotionally secure inside a relationship, they often stop paying attention to themselves. Their focus shifts outward. Their happiness becomes connected to another person's presence, approval, attention, or consistency. Without realizing it, they slowly build their emotional home inside someone else. That is why abandonment feels so devastating. It is not only the loss of the person, it is the collapse of the identity you built around them. Suddenly, you no longer know who you are without the connection. The mornings feel strange. The silence feels heavier. Even ordinary things begin carrying emotional weight. A song reminds you of them. A place reminds you of them. A memory appears without warning and pulls your chest tight. The mind keeps searching for ways to undo what happened. It replays conversations. It searches for mistakes. It asks endless questions. Why did they leave? What changed? Was I not enough? Could I have saved it? But beneath all those questions, another question quietly waits to be noticed. Why did losing them make me lose myself too? That is where awakening begins, because abandonment has a painful way of exposing emotional dependence. It reveals how much of your identity was attached to being chosen. It reveals how much of your peace depended on someone else's presence. It reveals how deeply you feared standing alone with yourself. And although that realization hurts, it is also liberating. Before abandonment, many people live emotionally asleep. They do not notice how much validation controls them. They do not notice how often they abandon their own needs to maintain connection. They do not notice how much of their worth depends on feeling wanted. Everything seems fine as long as someone stays. But once someone leaves, all the hidden emotional cracks suddenly become visible. This is why heartbreak often feels bigger than the relationship itself. The pain is not only about the person, it is about every wound the abandonment awakens. Old fears rise to the surface. Childhood rejection returns. Forgotten insecurities begin speaking again. The nervous system panics. The ego feels humiliated. The heart feels abandoned not only in the present moment, but by every painful memory still living inside it. Buddhist teachings often explain that suffering becomes transformation when awareness enters pain instead of running from it. The problem is that most people spend the entire abandonment trying to get the person back instead of understanding what the pain is trying to teach them. So they chase, they beg, they over-explain, they blame themselves, they search for closure, they wait for messages, they replay memories endlessly. And in the process, they unknowingly delay their own awakening. Because abandonment changes, meaning the moment you stop seeing it only as rejection and begin seeing it as revelation. Sometimes being left behind reveals how little you respected yourself. Sometimes it reveals how much emotional neglect you tolerated. Sometimes it reveals how often you ignored your intuition because you feared loneliness more than suffering. Sometimes it reveals how desperately you needed someone else's love to feel valuable. These truths are uncomfortable, but they are powerful, because once you see them clearly, you can no longer remain emotionally unconscious. One of the strangest things about abandonment is that it often awakens strength you never knew you had. At first, you believe the pain will destroy you. The nights feel endless. Your chest feels heavy. Even small tasks feel exhausting. But slowly, something begins happening beneath the grief. You start surviving days you thought would break you. You begin carrying pain you once believed was impossible to endure, and without realizing it, resilience begins growing quietly inside you. This is one reason why suffering changes people so deeply. Not because pain itself is beautiful, but because surviving pain reveals hidden capacities within the human spirit. Comfort rarely forces people to discover their inner strength. Comfort allows people to stay emotionally dependent for years without noticing it. But abandonment removes the illusion of safety and pushes you inward. At first, going inward feels frightening. You meet emotions you avoided for years: loneliness, fear, shame, anger, insecurity, grief, regret. But eventually, after enough tears and silence, something important happens. You stop searching outside yourself for rescue. You begin listening to yourself. This is where emotional independence begins quietly forming. Not in dramatic ways, not overnight, but slowly. You begin noticing that you can survive difficult emotions without immediately needing someone to soothe them. You begin realizing that your worth does not disappear because one person walked away. You begin discovering parts of yourself that existed long before the relationship ever began. This changes everything, because before awakening, many people believe love is supposed to complete them. But abandonment often teaches the opposite lesson. It teaches that no relationship can permanently stabilize a person who has abandoned themselves internally. This is why some people move from relationship to relationship, carrying the same suffering everywhere. They go, they think the pain comes from being unloved, when in reality much of the suffering comes from never building a relationship with themselves. Abandonment forces that relationship to begin. For the first time in years, you are left alone with your own thoughts. No constant distraction, no emotional escape, no person to hide inside emotionally. And although that loneliness feels sharp at first, it slowly becomes sacred. Because in that silence you begin hearing yourself again. You begin noticing your real desires, your real boundaries, your real exhaustion, your real emotional needs. Before abandonment, you may have spent years adapting yourself to maintain connection. You became smaller to avoid conflict. You became quieter to avoid rejection. You accepted less than you deserved because losing the relationship felt more frightening than losing yourself. But once abandonment happens fully, a strange freedom slowly appears. There is no more role left to perform, no more exhausting emotional negotiation, no more waiting for approval, no more shrinking yourself to remain loved. The loss hurts deeply, but the performance finally ends. And that ending creates space for authenticity. This is why many people eventually become stronger after heartbreak than they were before love. Before the pain, they often lived unconsciously, shaped entirely by fear of abandonment. After the pain, they begin building a life rooted in self-respect instead of emotional dependency. At first, however, the ego resists this awakening. The ego wants revenge. It wants validation. It wants the person to regret leaving. It wants proof that you mattered. And this is normal. Human beings naturally want reassurance after rejection. But Buddhism gently teaches that true healing does not come from making someone else realize your value. True healing begins when you realize your value without needing their recognition. That realization is one of the deepest forms of freedom, because many people spend years trying to be chosen by others while never truly choosing themselves. They wait for love to confirm their worth. They wait for attention to confirm their attractiveness. They wait for commitment to confirm their importance. But abandonment disrupts this illusion violently. It forces the painful question forward. If someone leaves me, do I still believe I am worthy? Most people do not realize how fragile their self-worth is until abandonment tests it. This is why being left behind can become such a powerful spiritual turning point. It exposes every place where your identity depended on external validation. And once exposed, healing can finally begin. Healing does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It means becoming emotionally rooted. There is a difference. Numbness closes the heart. Rootedness strengthens it. A rooted person can still love deeply, but they no longer collapse when someone leaves. Their identity is not built entirely on external attachment anymore. Their peace does not disappear every time another human changes emotionally. This kind of inner stability usually develops through suffering, not comfort. Comfort often keeps people dependent. They avoid difficult truths because the relationship still gives temporary emotional relief. But abandonment removes the comfort suddenly. It strips away distractions. It leaves you face to face with your inner world. And although that confrontation feels brutal at first, it eventually becomes clarifying. You start seeing patterns you ignored before. You notice how often you confused intensity with love. You notice how often you accepted inconsistency because you feared emptiness. You notice how often you abandoned your intuition to preserve connection. And slowly, your standards begin changing, not from bitterness, not from anger, but from awareness. This is why many awakened people become quieter after abandonment. Not because they no longer care about love, but because they finally understand the cost of losing themselves inside attachment. They become more careful with their energy, more honest about red flags, more protective of their peace, more willing to walk away from emotional instability. This is not coldness, this is wisdom earned through pain. One of the most important awakenings hidden inside abandonment is self-respect. Before heartbreak, many people believe self-respect means confidence or pride. But true self-respect is much deeper. It is the willingness to stop chasing what keeps hurting you. It is the courage to stop begging for what should be freely given. It is the ability to recognize when love is costing your dignity. Abandonment often becomes the moment where people finally discover this lesson. Not immediately. At first, they still want the connection back. They still romanticize the past. They still hope things will return to how they were. But eventually, exhaustion creates clarity. One day, they become tired of abandoning themselves just to remain emotionally connected to someone unavailable. And in that moment, something powerful shifts internally. They stop asking, "How do I make them love me again?" and start asking, "Why did I believe I had to earn basic care in the first place?" That question changes lives, because many people unknowingly build relationships around emotional hunger instead of mutual peace. They become addicted to earning affection. The uncertainty creates emotional obsession. Small moments of validation begin feeling intoxicating because the relationship itself feels unstable. This is why abandonment sometimes feels like withdrawal from addiction. The nervous system becomes dependent on emotional unpredictability. The highs and lows create attachment chemistry that feels powerful, but underneath it is usually fear, inconsistency, and emotional insecurity. Once abandonment interrupts that cycle, the body initially panics. But over time, stability begins returning. The mind becomes clearer. The emotional chaos settles, and for the first time in a long time, peace starts feeling possible again. This is one reason why many people eventually look back at painful endings with surprising gratitude. Not because the abandonment itself was enjoyable, but because it forced growth that comfort never would have created. Some people only begin respecting themselves after someone leaves them. Some only begin healing childhood wounds after heartbreak exposes them. Some only begin building boundaries after emotional pain becomes unbearable. Some only begin discovering their purpose after loss completely rearranges their identity. This is the silent awakening hidden inside abandonment. At first, it looks like destruction, but underneath, transformation is quietly beginning. The old version of you starts collapsing. The version addicted to external validation. The version terrified of loneliness. The version willing to sacrifice peace for attention. The version constantly seeking reassurance from emotionally unavailable people. That version begins dying slowly. And although ego experiences this as suffering, the soul experiences it as liberation. Buddhist teachings often explain that attachment creates illusion because it convinces you that your stability depends on external conditions remaining permanent. But nothing external remains permanent. People change, feelings shift, relationships evolve, life moves constantly. So if your entire emotional foundation depends on another person never changing, suffering becomes inevitable. Abandonment reveals this truth painfully but honestly, and honesty is necessary for awakening, because once you stop depending entirely on external love to feel whole, a different kind of peace begins forming, a quieter peace, a more stable peace, one rooted inside awareness rather than possession. This does not mean you stop loving people. It means your survival no longer depends on their presence. That difference is freedom. Many people never experience true emotional independence because they spend their entire lives trying to escape loneliness through attachment. They constantly need someone emotionally close in order to feel safe. So they tolerate unhealthy dynamics rather than face themselves alone. But abandonment forces solitude into their lives. And solitude becomes a teacher. At first, solitude feels empty, then uncomfortable, then reflective, then healing. Eventually, solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like space. Space to breathe, space to think clearly, space to rediscover your identity without constant emotional pressure, space to hear your intuition again. This is why many spiritually awakened people eventually become grateful for periods of loneliness. Those lonely seasons often rebuilt them from the inside out. Not quickly, not easily, but deeply. Because abandonment removes illusions violently. It strips away fantasies about who people are. It strips away denial about unhealthy patterns. It strips away emotional dependence disguised as love. And once illusions collapse, truth finally has room to breathe. Truth about what you deserve. Truth about what hurts you. Truth about what keeps repeating. Truth about the ways you abandon yourself when afraid of abandonment from others. This level of awareness changes relationships forever. You stop chasing emotionally unavailable people. You stop begging for consistency. You stop trying to convince others to value you. You stop confusing emotional chaos with deep connection. You stop tolerating disrespect because attention alone no longer feels enough. And, perhaps most importantly, you stop seeing abandonment as proof of your unworthiness. This is one of the deepest shifts of all, because before awakening, abandonment feels personal. It feels like evidence that you were not lovable enough, attractive enough, important enough, or valuable enough. But eventually, awareness reveals something deeper. People leave for many reasons, sometimes because they are emotionally immature, sometimes because they are disconnected from themselves, sometimes because the connection completed its purpose, sometimes because they are unable to meet you where you are emotionally, sometimes because life itself changes direction. Their leaving does not automatically define your worth. And once you fully understand this, abandonment loses much of its power to destroy you. You may still grieve. You may still miss them. You may still feel sadness when memories appear. But you no longer build your identity around being left behind. Instead, you begin building yourself around awareness. Awareness of your needs. Awareness of your boundaries. Awareness of your emotional patterns. Awareness of your worth beyond external validation. This is the awakening hidden quietly inside abandonment. Not bitterness, not emotional numbness, not permanent distrust, but deeper self-knowledge, stronger self-respect, greater emotional independence. And perhaps the most beautiful part is this. Once you stop fearing abandonment so deeply, you stop abandoning yourself to keep people close. You stop over-explaining. You stop shrinking. You stop tolerating emotional confusion just to avoid loneliness. You stop sacrificing peace to maintain attachment. And from that place, love itself becomes healthier, because now you can love without losing yourself. You can care deeply without collapsing emotionally every time someone changes. You can appreciate connection without trying to possess it. You can allow people to choose freely without believing their choices determine your value. This is emotional maturity. This is inner awareness. This is what abandonment can awaken when pain is met with honesty instead of denial. So, if someone has left your life and the wound still aches, understand this gently. The pain may feel like destruction right now, but hidden inside it is an invitation to rebuild your relationship with yourself, an invitation to stop searching for worth outside your own spirit, an invitation to become emotionally rooted instead of emotionally dependent. Because sometimes the people who leave your life awaken the strongest version of you, not through comfort, not through reassurance, but through the silence they leave behind after they are gone. And once abandonment stops feeling like the end of your worth, another realization slowly begins to unfold. Not everyone is meant to walk beside you forever, because you are not the same person throughout your entire life. As your awareness changes, your emotional world changes with it. The people who once felt deeply aligned with your soul may no longer fit the person you are becoming. And resisting this truth is where another kind of suffering quietly begins. Some relationships do not fall apart because someone is evil. Sometimes they fade because your spirit is evolving in a different direction. There is a quiet grief that comes with outgrowing people, not because you stop caring about them, but because something inside you no longer feels at home in the connection. Conversations that once excited you now leave you emotionally tired. Places that once felt comforting now feel heavy. Behaviors you once ignored now disturb your peace. You begin sensing distance even when nothing dramatic has happened. And this confuses many people because they think every relationship must end through betrayal, conflict, or disaster. But Buddhism teaches that life moves in seasons, and human connections move with it. Some people belong to the season where you were still learning self-worth. Some belong to the season where you were healing loneliness. Some belong to the season where you were emotionally asleep. And some belong to the season where you finally begin waking up. The difficulty is that the human heart wants permanence. It wants people to remain emotionally frozen in the role they once played. It wants the connection to feel exactly the way it felt in the beginning. But life does not move in circles. It moves forward. Consciousness changes, awareness deepens, priorities shift, and relationships naturally transform as the soul evolves. This truth can feel painful because many people secretly believe that change means loss. But change is not always loss. Sometimes change is evidence that growth is happening. A child eventually outgrows certain clothes. A tree eventually outgrows the pot it started in. And human beings eventually outgrow certain emotional environments. This does not make the old season worthless. It simply means it was temporary. One of the biggest causes of emotional stagnation is trying to force old versions of yourself to survive through relationships that no longer align with who you are becoming. You keep returning to people who fit your old wounds because they feel familiar. You keep maintaining dynamics that match your previous level of consciousness because growth feels uncertain. You keep shrinking your evolving spirit to preserve emotional comfort. And slowly, your soul begins feeling trapped. This is why some people feel exhausted around certain relationships, even when no obvious conflict exists. Their inner world is changing, but their external life remains attached to old emotional patterns. They are evolving internally, while still trying to live inside connections that belong to a previous version of themselves. That inner conflict creates suffering. At first, you may not even understand why the relationship suddenly feels different. You may blame yourself for becoming distant. You may feel guilty for needing space. You may try harder to reconnect emotionally, hoping things will feel natural again. But underneath, something deeper is happening. Your awareness is shifting. The things that once entertained you no longer fulfill you. The conversations that once distracted you no longer nourish you. The emotional games that once felt exciting now feel draining. You begin craving honesty, peace, depth, and emotional safety in ways you never did before. And because of this shift, certain people naturally change roles in your life. Some become distant, some become temporary, some become teachers instead of companions, some become memories instead of daily presence. This is one of the hardest spiritual lessons to accept because attachment wants every meaningful connection to remain permanent. But Buddhism teaches impermanence not as punishment, but as reality. Everything changes form over time. Relationships are not excluded from this truth. Even the people you deeply love may not stay connected to you in the same way forever. This does not mean love failed. It means life continued moving. Many people resist emotional seasons because they confuse endings with rejection. They think if a relationship changes, something must be wrong. But not every distance is betrayal. Sometimes people are simply no longer growing in the same direction. One person may begin seeking peace while the other still seeks chaos. One may become more self-aware while the other remains emotionally unconscious. One may start healing while the other avoids inner work completely. And over time, the connection naturally changes shape. This can feel heartbreaking because emotionally, you still remember the old closeness. You remember the laughter, the understanding, the familiarity. But memory alone cannot sustain alignment. People are not meant to remain emotionally identical forever. The Buddhist understanding of emotional seasons teaches something very freeing. Relationships are not only about attachment, they are also about timing, growth, consciousness, and purpose. Some people enter your life to support one chapter, not the entire story. And when that chapter ends, forcing the relationship to remain unchanged creates emotional stagnation. You stop growing because you are too busy preserving the past. This happens often in friendships, romantic relationships, and even family connections. A person who once understood you deeply may no longer understand the person you are becoming. At first, you may desperately try to explain yourself. You try to pull them into your new awareness. You try to recreate old closeness. But slowly, you realize something difficult. Not everyone is meant to evolve beside you forever. This realization hurts because humans naturally fear separation. We attach identity to continuity. We feel safe when things stay familiar. But spiritual growth often requires discomfort because growth asks you to release emotional environments that no longer reflect your evolving truth. And sometimes that release happens quietly, without arguments, without dramatic endings, without hatred, just distance, silence, different priorities, different energy, different paths. At first, the ego resists this deeply. It keeps asking, how do I make things go back to how they were? But awareness slowly begins asking a wiser question. Why am I trying to force an old season to continue when life is clearly moving forward? That question changes everything, because emotional suffering often grows from resisting natural transformation. You keep trying to relive an emotional chapter your soul has already outgrown. You revisit old dynamics, hoping they will nourish you the same way, but what once helped you survive may no longer help you grow. This is especially painful when relationships are connected to identity. Some people knew you during your most wounded years. Some knew you before healing began. Some knew the version of you that tolerated emotional chaos because you did not yet know your worth. But healing changes emotional tolerance. As consciousness evolves, your relationship with yourself changes. You begin noticing things you ignored before. You notice manipulation more quickly. You notice emotional imbalance sooner. You notice when conversations revolve entirely around negativity, gossip, ego, or emotional immaturity. And because awareness has increased, your nervous system can no longer comfortably live inside the same emotional environments. This creates distance naturally, not from superiority, not from arrogance, but from evolution. Buddhist teachings remind us that attachment to fixed identities creates suffering. This includes attachment to fixed relationship roles. You may still see someone as the person who always understands me, even while reality shows the connection no longer functions that way. You may still see yourself as emotionally dependent on someone whose role in your life has already changed. And this refusal to accept change keeps people emotionally trapped. They stay in outdated dynamics long after the relationship has stopped nourishing either person. They cling to emotional memories instead of present reality. They fear letting the relationship evolve because they think evolution automatically means loss. But sometimes allowing relationships to change is an act of love, not abandonment. A flower cannot bloom forever in spring. A river cannot remain still and continue flowing. And a soul cannot evolve while clinging tightly to every old emotional season. This truth becomes clearer as people awaken spiritually. The more conscious you become, the more carefully you begin protecting your inner peace. Not because you no longer care about people, but because you finally understand how deeply emotional environments affect the spirit. You begin noticing which relationships leave you calm and which leave you emotionally depleted. You begin noticing who supports your growth and who unconsciously resists it. You begin noticing who celebrates your healing and who only feels comfortable when you remain emotionally small. This awareness changes relationships naturally. Some people grow with you, some drift away. Some only know how to connect to the wounded version of you. And when that wounded version begins healing, the relationship itself struggles to survive. This can feel lonely at first, very lonely, because growth often creates temporary isolation. You no longer fully belong to your old emotional world, but you have not yet fully stepped into your new one. There is a period where everything feels uncertain. Familiar relationships feel different. Familiar environments feel strange. Even your own mind feels unfamiliar sometimes. But this discomfort is often a sign of transformation. A caterpillar cannot become a butterfly without first dissolving inside the cocoon. Growth always includes periods where identity shifts uncomfortably. Relationships change during these periods because your consciousness itself is changing, and consciousness determines connection. This is why certain people suddenly appear in your life exactly when your awareness evolves. As your energy changes, you begin attracting different kinds of relationships. More honest people, more peaceful people, more emotionally mature people, more spiritually aware people. Not because you became better than others, but because your inner world changed frequency. You no longer seek the same things. You no longer tolerate the same things. You no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. This shift is powerful, but many people sabotage it by clinging to expired emotional seasons. They feel guilty for changing. They fear disappointing others. They fear appearing distant or cold. So they continue participating in relationships that no longer align with their spirit. And slowly, stagnation begins forming. Stagnation is dangerous because it keeps people spiritually asleep. They stop evolving because they are too busy preserving emotional familiarity. They keep repeating the same conversations, the same conflicts, the same emotional patterns year after year. Nothing changes, nothing deepens, nothing heals. Life becomes repetitive instead of transformative. Buddhism teaches that attachment to permanence blinds people to the natural movement of existence. Everything changes constantly. Even, you are not the same person you were 1 year ago. Your thoughts change, your desires change, your wounds change, your understanding changes. So why would every relationship remain exactly the same forever? Once you accept emotional seasons, relationships become lighter, not less meaningful, but less possessive. You stop demanding permanence from every connection. You stop forcing people to remain in roles they have naturally outgrown. You stop measuring love only by duration. Instead, you begin appreciating what each season brought into your life. Some seasons taught joy, some taught heartbreak, some taught boundaries, some taught self-respect, some taught healing, some taught awareness. Every emotional season carries wisdom if you stop resisting its movement. This perspective softens bitterness. You no longer need to turn every ending into betrayal. Sometimes two people simply stop meeting each other at the same level emotionally. Sometimes growth changes compatibility. Sometimes healing changes attraction. Sometimes awareness changes priorities, and that is okay. One of the deepest forms of suffering comes from expecting old emotional seasons to continue nourishing you forever. But emotional nourishment changes as consciousness changes. What once fulfilled you may eventually feel empty. This is why some people suddenly lose interest in relationships that once consumed them emotionally. It is not always because love disappeared. Sometimes awareness simply outgrew attachment. And when this happens, forcing yourself to remain emotionally invested creates inner conflict. Your soul wants movement. Your attachment wants familiarity. And the battle between those two forces creates exhaustion. Many people spend years emotionally tired because they are living against their own spiritual evolution. They keep surrounding themselves with environments that no longer reflect who they are becoming. They keep replaying old emotional roles because change feels uncertain. But uncertainty is often where awakening begins. Buddhist wisdom encourages presence because presence allows you to see relationships clearly as they are now, not only as they once were. This clarity is liberating. It allows you to appreciate connections without clinging to fixed outcomes. It allows you to release relationships without needing hatred. It allows you to honor memories without becoming trapped inside them. You begin understanding that people can be deeply meaningful and still temporary. That realization changes attachment profoundly. Instead of desperately trying to freeze every beautiful experience, you begin learning how to experience connection fully while still allowing life to move naturally. This creates a different kind of love, a less fearful love, a less controlling love, a love rooted in awareness instead of possession. You stop needing guarantees. You stop demanding forever from every meaningful connection. You stop panicking every time relationships evolve. And because of this, emotional freedom slowly enters your life. Freedom to grow, freedom to change, freedom to let others change too, freedom to honor seasons without forcing them to last beyond their natural purpose. This freedom does not remove grief completely. You may still feel sadness when people drift away. You may still miss old versions of relationships. You may still feel nostalgic for emotional seasons that once brought comfort, but the sadness becomes softer because resistance disappears. You stop fighting reality. You stop demanding that life remain emotionally frozen. And once resistance loosens, suffering loosens with it. This is one reason emotionally awakened people often become calmer about endings. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally understand movement is natural. They no longer see change as immediate catastrophe. They understand that every emotional season carries purpose, even if temporary. Some people arrive to accompany your healing. Some arrive to awaken your strength. Some arrive to mirror your wounds. Some arrive to teach love. Some arrive to teach release. And some arrive only long enough to remind you that life itself is constantly transforming. The moment you stop resisting emotional seasons, your relationships become healthier. You stop clinging so tightly. You stop trying to control every outcome. You stop suffocating connections with fear of change. You allow people to evolve naturally, including yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you stop abandoning your own growth just to maintain emotional familiarity. Because many people secretly remain emotionally small to keep old relationships comfortable. They hide their healing. They suppress their truth. They shrink their awareness. They silence their evolution because they fear losing connection. But true growth requires honesty. And honesty sometimes changes relationships. This is not failure. This is life moving. The Buddhist understanding of emotional seasons teaches that suffering increases whenever you demand permanence from a world built entirely on transformation. Relationships are living experiences, not frozen objects. They breathe, shift, deepen, weaken, evolve, and sometimes end. Trying to stop this movement creates pain. Accepting this movement creates wisdom. So if certain relationships in your life no longer feel aligned, pause before judging yourself harshly. Not every distance means hatred. Not every ending means failure. Not every changing connection means someone did something wrong. Sometimes your soul is simply entering a new season. And new seasons require different forms of connection. The people who once walked beside you may no longer understand your path completely. Some may disappear quietly. Some may remain, but in different roles. Some may become memories instead of daily presence. Some may surprise you by growing alongside you beautifully. But whatever changes, the deeper lesson remains the same. Life moves, people evolve, consciousness expands, and resisting these emotional seasons traps the heart in stagnation. Yet when you accept the changing nature of relationships, something peaceful begins happening inside you. You stop trying to imprison life inside permanence. You stop forcing every chapter to become the entire story. You stop measuring love only by how long it lasts. Instead, you begin seeing relationships as sacred seasons of growth. Some short, some long, some gentle, some painful, but all meaningful in their own way. And when you finally understand this deeply, you stop fearing change so much. You begin trusting that every season, even the difficult ones, carries wisdom your soul needs for the next stage of awakening. And when you begin to understand that life moves in emotional seasons, another deeper truth starts to rise. Some people do not only belong to a season of your life, they also test how much of yourself you are willing to lose just to keep that season alive. This is where love becomes dangerous, not because love itself is wrong, but because attachment can quietly turn affection into self-abandonment. You start by caring deeply, then slowly you begin trading your peace for their presence, your truth for their approval, and your identity for the hope that they will stay. There is a kind of love that does not break your heart all at once. It drains you slowly until one day you look at yourself and wonder where your peace went. At first, it feels beautiful. You meet someone who touches a soft place inside you, and suddenly the world feels warmer. Their voice becomes familiar. Their attention feels like sunlight. Their presence gives your day a certain meaning. You begin making space for them in your thoughts, your plans, your emotions, and your future. There is nothing wrong with this. The heart was made to connect. The problem begins when connection becomes dependence, and dependence begins asking you to betray yourself in small ways. You may not notice the first betrayal. It may look harmless. You ignore a feeling in your chest because you do not want to seem difficult. You stay silent when something hurts you because you fear starting an argument. You pretend to be okay with less effort, less care, less honesty, because you are afraid asking for more will push them away. You tell yourself you are being patient. You tell yourself love requires understanding. You tell yourself every relationship needs sacrifice. But not every sacrifice is love. Some sacrifices are wounds trying to survive. Buddhist teachings remind us that suffering often begins when we cling to something so tightly that we stop seeing clearly. When attachment takes over, the mind stops asking, "Is this peaceful?" and starts asking, "How do I keep this person?" That single shift can quietly destroy your inner world. Because once keeping someone becomes more important than keeping your peace, you begin negotiating with your own pain. You start accepting what once would have wounded your dignity. You start explaining away behavior that disturbs your spirit. You start lowering your needs until they become small enough for someone else to ignore comfortably. You start believing that if you can just be more understanding, more forgiving, more patient, more quiet, more useful, more attractive, more available, then maybe the relationship will finally feel safe. But peace does not come from becoming less of yourself. Peace comes from being able to stand inside your own truth without fear of being abandoned for it. This is why loving someone more than your own peace becomes so painful. It pulls you away from your center. You begin living outside yourself, constantly watching their moods, their words, their silence, their attention, their distance. Your happiness becomes tied to signals you cannot control. If they are warm, you feel alive. If they are distant, your whole day collapses. If they respond quickly, you feel chosen. If they disappear emotionally, you begin questioning your worth. This is not love in its pure form. This is attachment turning another person into the keeper of your nervous system. And the sad part is, many people do not recognize this as suffering because it feels intense. They mistake the emotional highs and lows for depth. They think, I must really love this person because I feel so much. But not everything intense is healthy. Anxiety can be intense. Fear can be intense. Obsession can be intense. Longing can be intense. The depth of your emotion does not always prove the depth of the connection. Sometimes it proves the depth of the wound being touched. True love may move you deeply, but it should not make you disappear from yourself. When attachment becomes stronger than awareness, affection slowly becomes self-betrayal. You betray yourself every time you say yes when your spirit is saying no. You betray yourself every time you accept confusion because clarity might force you to make a decision. You betray yourself every time you silence your pain to protect someone else from accountability. You betray yourself every time you choose the comfort of their presence over the honesty of your own heart. And self-betrayal has a cost. At first, the cost is small, a little anxiety, a little overthinking, a little sadness you hide from others. Then it grows. You begin losing sleep. You lose focus. You lose interest in things that once gave you joy. Your body becomes tense. Your mind becomes busy. Your spirit becomes tired. You may still call it love, but deep inside, something knows you are not at peace. This is the moment many people ignore because the truth feels too expensive. If they admit the relationship is costing their peace, then they may have to change something. They may have to stop chasing. They may have to speak honestly. They may have to set a boundary. They may have to let go. And sometimes, people would rather suffer in familiar attachment than face the unknown freedom of choosing themselves. So they stay. They stay emotionally available to someone who is emotionally inconsistent. They stay loyal to someone who only gives partial effort. They stay open to someone who keeps them confused. They stay hopeful because leaving would feel like admitting the love they gave was not enough to save the connection. But love is not supposed to be a rescue mission where you drown trying to keep another person afloat. Buddhist wisdom teaches compassion, but compassion does not mean carrying another person at the cost of your own suffering. Compassion must include yourself. Many people forget this. They think being loving means being endlessly tolerant. They think being spiritual means never walking away. They think having a good heart means giving people unlimited access to their energy, no matter how much pain it creates. But a heart without boundaries becomes a place where suffering enters freely. There is nothing noble about losing yourself in the name of love. There is nothing enlightened about staying where your peace is constantly disturbed. There is nothing spiritual about abandoning your own well-being so another person can remain comfortable with your silence. Real love does not demand the death of your inner peace. This does not mean love will never be difficult. Every meaningful relationship will face uncomfortable moments. People misunderstand each other. People make mistakes. People carry wounds. But there is a difference between temporary discomfort and repeated emotional erosion. One asks for patience. The other asks for awakening. Temporary discomfort still contains care. There is repair. There is honesty. There is mutual effort. There is willingness to understand. But emotional erosion feels like slowly becoming smaller. You keep bending until your own shape disappears. You keep forgiving without change. You keep listening without being heard. You keep giving without receiving enough tenderness to feel safe. That is not a rough season. That is your spirit being worn down. And the body often knows before the mind admits it. You feel tightness when their name appears. You feel nervous before speaking honestly. You feel relief when they are kind, but the relief does not last, because part of you is always waiting for the next distance, the next silence, the next emotional withdrawal. Your peace becomes temporary, dependent on whether they are gentle today. This is how attachment steals stability. It makes peace conditional. It says you can relax when they reassure you. It says you can feel worthy when they choose you. It says you can breathe when they stop being distant. But Buddhist teachings point us back inward. They remind us that anything outside you can change at any moment. If your peace depends completely on something unstable, then your suffering will keep rising and falling with it. This is why emotional independence matters, not because you should become cold, but because you must learn not to hand your whole inner world to another person. You can love someone deeply and still remain rooted in yourself. You can care for someone and still protect your peace. You can want someone in your life without making them the owner of your happiness. The problem begins when wanting becomes needing, and needing becomes fear. Fear makes you abandon yourself. Fear makes you tolerate what wisdom would reject. Fear makes you confuse losing someone with losing your future. Fear makes you believe peace without them is impossible, even if peace with them has already disappeared. And this is one of attachment's cruelest tricks. It makes you afraid to lose the very person whose presence is already making you lose yourself. You become loyal to your own exhaustion. You defend the relationship to others because admitting the truth feels humiliating. You say, they are just going through a lot. You say, they are not always like this. You say, you do not understand what we have. And maybe all of that is partly true. But another truth still remains. You are tired. You are anxious. You are no longer yourself. Love should not require you to constantly prove that your pain is reasonable. When someone cares for your heart, you should not have to present your suffering like a court case. You should not have to beg for basic tenderness. You should not have to explain over and over why inconsistency hurts, why silence wounds, why disrespect breaks trust, why emotional distance creates fear. A person may not be perfect, but if they care, your pain will matter to them. Attachment, however, often makes people stay where their pain is repeatedly dismissed. They begin thinking, maybe I am too sensitive, maybe I ask for too much, maybe I should be grateful for whatever they give. This is how the loss of identity begins. You no longer trust your own feelings. You start measuring your needs through someone else's limited capacity to meet them. If they cannot love you properly, you assume your needs are excessive instead of realizing the connection may not be healthy for your spirit. This is how people become strangers to themselves. They forget what they like. They forget what they need. They forget how they used to laugh before the relationship became heavy. They forget the sound of their own inner voice because they have spent so long listening for someone else's approval. Their whole identity begins to orbit around one question: will they stay? And when that question becomes the center of your life, your soul becomes restless. Buddhism teaches that clinging creates suffering not because love is bad, but because clinging turns love into fear. When you cling, you are no longer simply appreciating someone's presence. You are gripping them as protection against loneliness, insecurity, and uncertainty. You are trying to use another person as shelter from your own inner discomfort. But no human being can permanently protect you from the work you must do inside yourself. This is why loving someone more than your own peace often reveals a deeper wound. You may think the pain is about the person, but underneath, it may be about the fear of not being chosen, the fear of being alone, the fear of being replaced, the fear that if this connection ends, it proves something terrible about your worth. And as long as those fears remain unconscious, attachment will keep feeling like love. But once awareness enters, you begin seeing differently. You begin asking, am I loving this person freely? Or am I clinging because I am afraid? Am I staying because there is peace here, or because leaving would force me to face myself? Am I being patient, or am I betraying my truth? Am I giving from love, or giving from fear that I will be abandoned if I stop? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are healing. They bring you back from fantasy into truth. And truth, even when painful, is kinder than illusion. Illusion lets you keep suffering while pretending things are fine. Truth may break your heart for a moment, but it also begins freeing your spirit. It shows you where you have crossed from love into self-abandonment. It shows you where your compassion has lost balance. It shows you where you need to return to yourself. Returning to yourself does not always mean leaving immediately. Sometimes it begins with honesty. You admit what hurts. You stop pretending confusion is peace. You stop calling anxiety love. You stop hiding your needs because someone else may not like them. You stop treating your boundaries like threats to the relationship. You begin listening to the quiet part of you that has been whispering, I cannot keep living like this. That whisper is important. It is not bitterness. It is not weakness. It is your inner wisdom trying to protect what attachment has been ignoring. Many people wait until they are completely broken before they listen to that inner voice. They wait until their body becomes tired, their mind becomes foggy, their joy disappears, and their self-respect feels far away. But awakening does not require total destruction. You can listen before the pain becomes unbearable. You can choose peace before resentment poisons the love. You can step back before you forget yourself completely. That is what detachment teaches. Detachment is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-respect within love. It means you can care deeply without allowing your care to become a weapon against your own peace. It means you can love someone without placing your entire identity in their hands. It means you can accept that your heart wants them, while still recognizing that your soul needs peace. And sometimes the soul must be louder than the heart. The heart remembers. The heart hopes. The heart wants what felt beautiful to return. The heart is tender, and that tenderness is not wrong. But the soul sees the cost. The soul sees when love has become waiting. The soul sees when affection has become fear. The soul sees when staying connected means staying wounded. This is why inner conflict becomes so strong. One part of you wants to hold on. Another part of you is exhausted from holding on. One part says, I love them. Another part says, but I am losing myself. And between those two voices, many people remain stuck for years. Buddhist awareness invites you to sit with both voices without running from either. Do not shame yourself for loving them. Do not shame yourself for being tired. Just see clearly. See the love. See the pain. See the hope. See the cost. See the truth of what the connection is doing to your inner life. Clarity is the beginning of freedom. Because once you clearly see that something is costing your peace, you can no longer fully hide from that knowledge. You may still struggle. You may still feel attached. You may still miss them. But a light has turned on inside you, and once awareness begins, unconscious suffering loses some of its power. You begin noticing the moments where you abandon yourself. You notice when you say, "It is okay," but your body knows it is not. You notice when you forgive too quickly just to avoid distance. You notice when you accept less because you fear asking for more. You notice when your mind turns one small act of kindness into proof that everything is fine, even though the pattern remains unchanged. This noticing is sacred. It may not feel dramatic, but it is transformation beginning. Many people think awakening means becoming instantly strong. But often, awakening begins as a quiet sadness. The sadness of realizing you have been participating in your own pain. The sadness of seeing how much peace you gave away. The sadness of understanding that love became a place where you kept disappearing. But do not turn that sadness into self-hatred. You were not foolish for loving deeply. You were human. You wanted connection. You wanted safety. You wanted to believe in someone. You wanted the beautiful beginning to become the whole story. There is tenderness in that. The lesson is not to punish yourself for loving. The lesson is to learn how to love without abandoning your own soul. That is a very different kind of love. It is quieter, more grounded, less desperate. It does not chase constant reassurance. It does not confuse suffering with devotion. It does not turn another person into a god. It does not kneel before inconsistency and call it destiny. It stands with an open heart and a steady spine. This kind of love says, "I can care about you, but I will not disappear for you." It says, "I can miss you, but I will not betray myself to keep you." It says, "I can honor what we shared, but I will not sacrifice my peace to preserve an illusion." It says, "I can love you, but I must also love the life inside me." This is where self-respect becomes a spiritual practice, not loud, not bitter, not cruel, just honest. Self-respect may look like pausing before responding from fear. It may look like not chasing after silence. It may look like asking for clarity instead of accepting confusion. It may look like walking away from conversations that turn your pain into drama. It may look like choosing sleep over overthinking. It may look like returning attention to your own life instead of spending every moment studying another person's behavior. Small acts of self-respect rebuild identity. Piece by piece, you begin coming back. You remember your own routines, your own interests, your own dreams, your own friendships, your own body, your own mind. You stop making one person the center of your emotional universe. You begin widening your life again, and as your life becomes wider, the attachment begins losing its grip. This does not mean the love vanishes instantly. Sometimes love remains even after clarity arrives. But the difference is, love no longer controls you in the same way. You may still feel tenderness, but you stop using tenderness as an excuse to suffer endlessly. You may still miss them, but missing them no longer means betraying yourself to return to pain. That is progress. That is healing. That is detachment becoming real. The pain of loving someone more than your own peace is that eventually the relationship stops being about love and becomes about survival. You survive their moods. You survive their distance. You survive the uncertainty. You survive the disappointment. But life is not meant to be spent surviving someone you love. Love should bring more truth into your life, not more confusion. More softness, not more self-doubt. More courage, not more fear. More presence, not more obsession. More connection, not the slow loss of yourself. And if love is asking you to abandon your peace, then it is no longer love alone. Attachment has entered. Fear has entered. Old wounds have entered. And those wounds must be seen with compassion before they keep choosing pain in the name of devotion. Buddhist teachings do not ask you to close your heart after being hurt. They ask you to purify your love from clinging, to love without grasping, to care without possessing, to give without disappearing, to stay open without becoming a prisoner of another person's presence or absence. This is not easy. It may be one of the hardest lessons in human life, because the heart wants what it wants, even when the soul is tired. But every time you choose peace over fear, even in a small way, you begin teaching yourself a new truth. You begin teaching yourself that love does not have to cost your identity. You begin teaching yourself that being chosen by another person is not worth losing yourself. You begin teaching yourself that your peace is not a small thing. Your peace is your home. And no person who truly belongs in your life should require you to burn that home down to keep them warm. So if you have been loving someone more than your own peace, do not attack yourself. Begin gently. Begin honestly. Begin by noticing where you have gone missing from your own life. Begin by asking what your heart needs, not only what the relationship needs. Begin by remembering that you are not here to become empty so someone else can feel full. Some people awaken your love, some awaken your wounds, some awaken your attachment, and some, through the pain they cause or the confusion they bring, awaken the part of you that finally says, "I cannot lose myself again." That moment is sacred, because when you finally choose peace, you are not rejecting love. You are returning love to its proper place. Love should be a river that nourishes your life, not a flood that destroys your inner home. Love should expand you, not erase you. Love should meet your humanity, not demand your self-abandonment as proof of devotion. And once you understand this, something inside you becomes stronger. You stop worshipping connection at the expense of your spirit. You stop calling exhaustion romance. You stop confusing pain with depth. You stop believing that losing yourself is the highest form of love. You begin to see that the most awakened love is not the one that makes you forget yourself. It is the one that allows you to remain whole. And once you begin choosing peace over self-abandonment, another painful illusion slowly begins to break apart. Many people believe that if a connection feels deep, intense, life-changing, or spiritually meaningful, then it must be meant to last forever. But life does not always work that way. Some of the deepest connections you will ever experience are not meant to stay permanently. Their purpose is not always to remain. Sometimes their purpose is simply to transform you. There are people who enter your life for a very short time, yet leave fingerprints on your soul that never disappear. At first, this feels unfair. The heart naturally assumes that depth should guarantee permanence. If someone touched you deeply, understood you deeply, awakened you deeply, then surely they are supposed to remain beside you forever. That belief feels natural because human beings connect depth with destiny. We think, no connection this powerful could possibly be temporary. But Buddhism teaches something very different. It teaches that intensity does not stop impermanence. Meaning does not stop change. Emotional depth does not create ownership over time. A sunset can be breathtaking and still disappear within minutes. A flower can be beautiful and still bloom for only a season. A conversation can change your entire life and still end after one night. Depth and permanence are not the same thing. This truth is difficult because the ego wants certainty. It wants emotional guarantees. It wants every meaningful experience to become permanent, so it never has to face grief, uncertainty, or change. But life constantly shows us that some of the most transformative moments are also temporary. The problem is not that temporary connections exist. The suffering begins when we refuse to accept their temporary nature. There is a special kind of heartbreak that comes from meeting someone who changes your inner world completely, only to later realize they were never meant to stay forever. Maybe they understood parts of you nobody else ever noticed. Maybe they awakened your spirit during a lonely period of your life. Maybe they arrived exactly when you needed comfort, healing, inspiration, or emotional awakening. And because the connection felt so meaningful, you believed it had to become permanent. But sometimes people enter your life for a chapter, not the entire journey. This does not make the connection less real. In fact, some temporary connections are more transformative than lifelong ones. A person may spend 20 years around you without changing your soul at all. Another person may spend 6 months in your life and permanently alter the way you see love, pain, healing, or yourself. Time alone does not determine impact. This is one reason Buddhist teachings encourage non-attachment, not because relationships are meaningless, but because clinging to permanence blinds us to the true nature of life. Everything moves, everything changes, every relationship exists inside time, and time itself is constantly transforming. The difficulty is that the heart often measures love by duration instead of transformation. We think, if it ended, then maybe it was not real. But reality does not work that way. Some connections are real precisely because they changed you forever, even if they did not stay. There are people whose purpose in your life was never to become your lifelong companion. Their purpose was to wake up something sleeping inside you. Some awaken your confidence. Some awaken your creativity. Some awaken your wounds. Some awaken your spirituality. Some awaken your courage to finally change your life. And once that awakening begins, their role naturally changes. At first, the mind fights this deeply. It keeps asking, why would something so meaningful end? But this question often comes from attachment, not awareness. Attachment believes meaningful things must remain permanent to matter. Awareness understands that temporary experiences can carry lifelong wisdom. Think about how many moments have shaped your life permanently, even though they lasted briefly. A sentence someone once said to you, a goodbye, a failure, a teacher, a stranger's kindness, a painful ending, a single conversation during a difficult season. Human beings are constantly transformed by moments that do not last forever. Relationships can be the same. Some people are bridges, not destinations. But attachment struggles with this because it wants ownership over emotional experiences. Once something touches the heart deeply, attachment begins saying, "This must belong to me permanently." And from that moment, fear enters the connection. Fear of losing it, fear of change, fear of endings, fear that if the person leaves, the meaning disappears too. But meaning does not disappear just because presence disappears. This is one of the deepest spiritual lessons about impermanence. A temporary person can permanently transform you. The teacher may leave, but the lesson remains. The relationship may end, but the awakening continues. The person may disappear, but the growth they triggered keeps unfolding for years. Understanding this changes the way you experience endings. You stop measuring relationships only by whether they lasted forever. Instead, you begin asking deeper questions. What did this connection awaken inside me? What did it teach me about myself? What illusion did it break? What truth did it reveal? What part of me began healing because of this experience? These questions shift the focus from possession to transformation. And transformation is often the real purpose. Many people suffer because they keep trying to turn every powerful connection into permanence instead of allowing it to complete its natural purpose. They keep chasing relationships long after the lesson has already been delivered. They keep trying to revive emotional seasons that were never meant to become permanent homes. This creates suffering because the soul often knows when something has fulfilled its role long before the mind accepts it. Deep inside, you may already feel the change. The energy shifts, the connection evolves, the relationship no longer flows naturally, but because the memories still feel powerful, you resist reality. You keep saying, but it meant so much. And yes, it did. But meaning alone does not stop impermanence. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when we confuse appreciation with possession. You can deeply appreciate someone without needing to own their presence forever. This is difficult because human beings naturally fear endings. We fear loss because we attach identity, comfort, and emotional safety to certain people. When someone deeply important leaves, it can feel like part of your own identity is disappearing too. But often, what is truly disappearing is the illusion that your peace depends entirely on them remaining unchanged forever. Impermanence destroys illusions, but it also creates freedom. Because once you stop demanding forever from every meaningful connection, relationships become lighter. You stop squeezing life so tightly. You stop trying to freeze beautiful moments in place. You begin allowing people to be who they are, not who your fear needs them to remain. This creates a softer kind of love, a less desperate love, a less controlling love, a love that can appreciate beauty without immediately trying to imprison it inside permanence. This does not mean you stop grieving endings. Grief is natural. The heart still aches when someone important leaves. Memories still return unexpectedly. Certain songs still carry emotional weight. Certain places still feel haunted by absence. But the grief changes shape when wisdom enters it. Instead of saying, "The connection ended, therefore it meant nothing," you begin understanding, "The connection ended, but its impact continues living inside me." That realization softens bitterness. One reason temporary people affect us so deeply is because they often arrive during emotionally vulnerable periods. They appear when we are lonely, confused, spiritually lost, emotionally wounded, or searching for meaning. Because of this timing, their presence feels almost magical. They become attached not only to our heart, but to the emotional transformation happening during that season of our life. Later, when the relationship changes or ends, we do not only miss the person, we miss the version of ourselves that existed during that emotional awakening. This creates another layer of grief. Sometimes you are not mourning the person alone. You are mourning how alive, hopeful, connected, inspired, or understood you felt while they were there. That is why certain people feel unforgettable. They arrived during a turning point in your consciousness. They became emotionally connected to a season of deep transformation inside you. And because of this, the heart believes they must remain forever. But life does not always preserve the messenger after the message has been delivered. This is painful, but also sacred. Some souls are temporary because their purpose is catalytic, not permanent. They enter your life to initiate movement. They shake you awake emotionally. They challenge your old identity. They force you to grow. They open doors inside your spirit that comfort never could. And once that transformation begins, their role naturally changes. This does not mean the connection failed. It means it fulfilled something important. Many people stay emotionally trapped because they refuse to separate meaning from permanence. They think if something ended, then it must have been a mistake. But not all endings are mistakes. Some endings are completion. A temporary teacher still changes the student. A temporary season still changes the landscape. A temporary love still changes the heart. Buddhist wisdom asks us to stop measuring value only through permanence. A moment can be temporary and still sacred. A relationship can be temporary and still life-changing. A person can leave and still continue shaping your consciousness long after they are gone. This perspective changes attachment deeply because it allows appreciation without desperate clinging. You stop trying to force every beautiful connection into forever. You stop panicking every time relationships evolve. You stop believing impermanence destroys meaning. Instead, you begin understanding that impermanence often creates meaning. The temporary nature of life is what makes moments precious in the first place. A sunset matters partly because it does not last forever. Youth matters partly because it changes. Certain conversations matter because they happened only once. Impermanence gives emotional experiences depth. This is why Buddhism does not teach emotional numbness toward relationships. It teaches awareness within relationships. Awareness that every connection exists inside change. Awareness that love becomes painful when it tries to resist reality. Awareness that people can matter deeply and still remain temporary. One of the hardest things to accept is that some people are only meant to accompany you through a specific phase of awakening. Once your consciousness changes, the relationship naturally transforms too. This does not erase what was shared. It simply means the soul continues moving. But attachment resists movement. It says, if this person leaves, I lose something irreplaceable. And perhaps part of that is true. Every meaningful connection leaves unique marks on the soul. No relationship can ever be duplicated perfectly. But losing presence does not erase the transformation already created. The growth remains, the wisdom remains, the awareness remains, the lessons remain. And often those inner changes matter more than physical permanence ever could. Some temporary people teach lifelong lessons about self-worth. Some teach emotional boundaries. Some teach vulnerability. Some teach forgiveness. Some teach courage. Some teach detachment. Some teach you how deeply you can feel. Some teach you what kind of love you no longer want to accept. And because these lessons become woven into your consciousness, the connection continues shaping you even after the person leaves. This is why healing does not always require forgetting someone. Sometimes healing means understanding their role differently. You stop seeing them only as someone who left. You begin seeing them as someone who transformed part of your journey. That perspective creates peace. Not instant peace, not painless peace, but a gentler understanding. Because once you stop demanding forever from every deep connection, the heart relaxes slightly. You stop treating endings like proof that love failed. You stop treating impermanence like punishment. You begin understanding that temporary connections are part of the human experience. And strangely enough, accepting impermanence often allows you to love more honestly. Fear creates control. Awareness creates freedom. When you fear loss constantly, relationships become tense. You monitor every shift in energy. You panic at distance. You cling tighter whenever change appears. But when you understand impermanence deeply, you begin appreciating people more fully in the present moment instead of constantly trying to secure the future. You become more present, more grateful, less controlling, less desperate. This does not mean you stop hoping meaningful people stay. It simply means you stop believing their staying is the only thing that gives the connection value. That difference changes everything. One reason temporary people leave such lasting emotional impact is because they often mirror parts of ourselves we had not fully met before. They reflect hidden desires, wounds, strengths, fears, dreams, and emotional capacities. Through them, we discover unknown parts of our own spirit. A temporary relationship may reveal how deeply you are capable of loving. Another may reveal how much healing you still need. Another may reveal your tendency toward attachment. Another may reveal your courage to finally change your life. These awakenings remain valuable even if the relationship itself changes form. And perhaps this is one of the deepest Buddhist truths about relationships. People are not always meant to belong to you permanently. Sometimes they are meant to participate in your awakening temporarily. This truth becomes especially difficult when the connection feels spiritual or rare. The mind says, "I will never meet someone like this again." Maybe that is true. Every soul is unique, but uniqueness does not automatically mean permanence. Some of the rarest connections are also the briefest, and yet their briefness does not reduce their beauty. A meteor crossing the sky lasts only seconds, yet people remember it for years. Some people are emotional meteors. They arrive suddenly, illuminate something inside you, then disappear into distance while leaving permanent light behind. At first, this feels heartbreaking. Later, it often feels sacred, because, with time, awareness deepens. You begin realizing that not everyone who changes your life is meant to remain inside it physically forever. Some people are transitional souls. They guide you from one stage of consciousness into another. Once the transition completes, the relationship naturally shifts. This is why forcing permanence can become so painful. You are trying to freeze a transformational process that was designed to move. You are trying to hold on to the bridge after you have already crossed the river, and because life itself keeps evolving, the harder you cling, the more suffering grows. Buddhism gently reminds us that beauty often exists precisely because things are temporary. Cherry blossoms bloom briefly, morning dew disappears quickly. Human life itself is temporary, yet impermanence does not remove meaning, it intensifies it. The same is true for relationships. A temporary person can awaken permanent compassion inside you. A temporary person can permanently change your understanding of love. A temporary person can permanently shift your path. A temporary person can permanently awaken your spirit. And once you truly understand this, your relationship with endings changes forever. You stop reducing every ending to failure. You stop believing permanence is the only proof of meaning. You stop trying to imprison beautiful experiences inside guarantees. Instead, you begin honoring people for what they awakened inside you, even if they could not stay forever. This does not mean you stop feeling grief. The human heart still mourns absence, but the grief becomes wiser, softer, more spacious. It no longer says, "This ended, therefore it was worthless." Instead it says, "This ended, but it changed me." That is a completely different kind of understanding. And from that understanding, emotional freedom slowly grows. You begin trusting life more deeply. You stop trying to control every relationship outcome. You stop seeing impermanence as immediate tragedy. You begin recognizing that life itself is a flowing process of meetings, lessons, awakenings, transformations, and releases. Some people stay long, some stay briefly, some return, some disappear forever. But every meaningful connection leaves something behind. The question is whether you will spend your life clinging to what left or awakening through what it came to teach. Because some people are not meant to stay forever. They are meant to arrive at exactly the right moment, awaken something essential inside you, and leave behind a transformation that continues long after their presence is gone. And perhaps that is not a lesser kind of love. Perhaps it is simply a different kind of sacred. And perhaps that is why certain people feel impossible to forget, not because they were meant to stay forever, but because they awakened something unfinished inside you. Yet if those inner wounds remain unseen, life has a strange way of repeating the same emotional lesson through different faces. The names change, the personalities change, the stories change, but the pain somehow feels painfully familiar. And after enough heartbreak, a quiet question finally begins to rise inside the soul. Why do I keep ending up here? There is a moment in many people's lives when they suddenly realize they are not just experiencing random heartbreaks. They are repeating patterns. At first, it does not look obvious. One relationship may seem completely different from the last. One person was distant, another was controlling, another was emotionally unavailable, another was inconsistent, another constantly made promises they could not keep. On the surface, they appear unrelated. But beneath the details, the emotional feeling stays strangely the same. The same anxiety, the same fear of abandonment, the same overthinking, the same emotional chasing. the same exhaustion, the same feeling of giving too much and receiving too little. And slowly, awareness begins noticing something uncomfortable. The suffering is not only connected to the people themselves, it is connected to something inside you that keeps choosing familiar pain. This is one of the deepest Buddhist understandings of karma. Karma is not simply punishment or reward. Karma is repetition through unconsciousness. It is the cycle of patterns repeating themselves until awareness finally interrupts them. Life keeps presenting the same lesson in different forms until the soul is ready to truly see it. This is why some people spend years trapped inside almost identical emotional stories. They meet different people, yet somehow arrive at the same heartbreak repeatedly. The details change, but the emotional destination remains familiar. One reason this happens is because human beings are unconsciously attracted to what feels emotionally familiar, even when that familiarity hurts them. The nervous system often mistakes familiarity for safety. So if someone grew up around inconsistency, emotional distance may later feel strangely attractive. If someone learned early in life that love must be earned through suffering, they may unconsciously feel uncomfortable around healthy love because peace feels unfamiliar. This is how emotional karma repeats itself. Not through magic, not through fate alone, but through unconscious attachment patterns moving from one relationship into the next. A person may leave a painful relationship swearing they will never tolerate that kind of pain again. But if the deeper wound remains unresolved, they often recreate the same emotional dynamic with someone new. Different face, same wound, different voice, same fear, different relationship, same suffering. At first, this realization feels discouraging. You begin wondering if you are cursed somehow. Why does the same pain keep finding you? Why do you keep attracting emotionally unavailable people? Why do you keep becoming attached to people who cannot meet you fully? Why do you keep ending up exhausted, anxious, abandoned, or emotionally neglected? But Buddhism gently shifts the focus away from blame and toward awareness. Instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" awareness begins asking, "What part of me keeps participating in this pattern?" That question changes everything, because many emotional cycles continue not simply because of the people you meet, but because unresolved wounds silently shape your choices, your reactions, your attractions, and your attachments. A person who fears abandonment deeply may cling harder whenever someone becomes distant. That clinging may push them further into anxiety, overgiving, and emotional self-abandonment. A person who secretly believes they are not enough may become addicted to earning love from emotionally unavailable people because finally being chosen by them feels emotionally validating. The relationship becomes less about love and more about proving worth. And because the wound remains unconscious, the pattern repeats. This is why awareness matters so much. Without awareness, people keep treating symptoms instead of roots. They blame every individual relationship separately without noticing the deeper emotional pattern connecting all of them. One relationship teaches the same lesson gently. The next teaches it more painfully. The next teaches it through devastation, until eventually awareness either awakens or suffering continues repeating itself. Life becomes a cycle of emotional echoes. This is why some heartbreaks feel strangely familiar, even when the person is completely new. Your soul recognizes the pattern before your conscious mind fully understands it. Deep inside, part of you already knows this emotional territory. The waiting, the confusion, the craving for reassurance, the fear of losing the connection, the emotional instability disguised as passion. You have walked this road before, but because attachment focuses on the person instead of the pattern, you keep believing the next relationship will magically heal the wound without requiring inner awareness. And this creates endless suffering. Buddhist teachings explain that unconscious attachment creates samsara, the endless cycle of repeated suffering. In relationships, this often appears as repeating emotional lessons through different people until consciousness evolves enough to break the cycle. The cycle may involve chasing unavailable love. It may involve abandoning yourself to avoid rejection. It may involve becoming emotionally addicted to inconsistency. It may involve confusing chaos with intimacy. It may involve believing your worth depends on being chosen. Whatever the wound is, life keeps presenting mirrors until you finally see yourself clearly. This can feel painful because the ego prefers blaming individuals completely. And yes, some people truly behave selfishly, manipulatively, or carelessly. But healing requires deeper honesty too. It requires asking why certain painful dynamics keep attracting you emotionally in the first place. That question is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that external change alone will solve internal suffering. Many people think a new relationship will heal their attachment wounds automatically. They believe, once I meet the right person, everything will finally feel peaceful. But unresolved wounds do not disappear simply because someone new arrives. In fact, intimacy often activates those wounds more strongly. A person can seem emotionally stable while single, then become anxious, fearful, and emotionally dependent once attachment forms. Why? Because relationships activate the deeper layers of unresolved emotional conditioning. This is why emotional karma repeats. The unresolved wound silently recreates familiar suffering until awareness interrupts the pattern. Sometimes the pattern begins in childhood. A child who received inconsistent affection may later become attached to emotionally unpredictable people because emotional inconsistency feels emotionally familiar. A child who had to suppress their needs to maintain connection may later become an adult who struggles to express boundaries in relationships. The body remembers old emotional survival strategies even when the conscious mind wants something healthier. This is why healing requires more than intellectual understanding. You may logically know a relationship is unhealthy, yet still feel emotionally pulled toward it. Attachment often lives deeper than conscious thought. It lives inside the nervous system, inside emotional memory, inside unconscious fear. That is why breaking emotional cycles takes awareness, patience, and compassion, not shame. Shame only deepens the wound. Many people become angry at themselves for repeating patterns. They call themselves foolish, weak, broken. But suffering repeated through unconsciousness does not make you broken, it makes you human. Most people repeat emotional patterns until awareness finally illuminates them. Awareness is the turning point, because once you clearly see the pattern, you can no longer fully pretend it is random. You begin noticing the early signs. You notice how quickly attachment forms around emotional inconsistency. You notice how your nervous system becomes activated around people who feel emotionally uncertain. You notice how peace sometimes feels less exciting than emotional unpredictability. And this realization can feel shocking. Some people discover they were never truly addicted to love itself. They were addicted to the emotional chase, the uncertainty, the longing, the emotional highs and lows, the fantasy of finally being chosen by someone difficult to reach. That fantasy becomes powerful because it promises emotional redemption. It says, if this person finally chooses me, then all my old wounds will heal. But no relationship can permanently heal wounds that require inner awareness and self-understanding. This is why emotional karma repeats across multiple relationships. The wound keeps searching externally for what must eventually be healed internally. One of the saddest parts of unconscious attachment is how easily people abandon themselves while trying to avoid abandonment from others. They ignore intuition. They silence boundaries. They overgive. They tolerate confusion. They chase clarity from emotionally unavailable people, all because the deeper wound says being left behind is unbearable, so they keep sacrificing themselves to preserve connection, and life keeps repeating the lesson, until one day, exhaustion finally creates awareness. This is often the true beginning of awakening, not when someone hurts you once, but when you suddenly recognize the pattern beneath many heartbreaks. You stop focusing only on who hurt you and begin understanding what inside you keeps participating in similar suffering. That realization is painful, but deeply liberating, because now healing becomes possible. Before awareness, every new relationship feels like a completely separate emotional story. After awareness, patterns become visible. You notice how quickly you ignore red flags when emotionally attached. You notice how strongly you crave reassurance from emotionally unavailable people. You notice how much of your self-worth becomes attached to another person's attention. This noticing interrupts unconsciousness, and once unconsciousness weakens, karma begins loosening its grip. This is why Buddhism places such importance on awareness. Awareness creates space between the wound and the reaction. Before awareness, attachment controls behavior automatically. Someone becomes distant, and panic immediately takes over. Someone withdraws emotionally, and you instantly begin chasing, overthinking, overgiving, or self-blaming. But awareness slows the process down. You begin observing your reactions instead of immediately obeying them. You notice your fear without letting it completely control you. You notice your urge to chase without automatically acting on it. You notice your attachment without completely becoming consumed by it. This is how cycles begin breaking, not through perfection, not overnight, but through conscious interruption. The cycle weakens every time you choose awareness over unconscious reaction. Every time you pause before abandoning yourself. Every time you choose honesty over emotional performance. Every time you stop chasing unavailable love. Every time you stop romanticizing suffering. Every time you stop treating anxiety like proof of deep connection. These moments slowly reshape your emotional life, because karma is not fixed destiny. It is unconscious repetition, and repetition can change once awareness enters. This is why emotionally awakened people often become quieter and more careful in relationships. Not because they fear love, but because they finally recognize how dangerous unconscious attachment can become. They stop rushing into emotional fusion. They stop ignoring discomfort simply because attraction exists. They stop making excuses for repeated emotional instability. Wisdom begins protecting the heart differently. Not through emotional walls, but through clearer seeing. One important realization during healing is understanding that not every emotional attraction is healthy simply because it feels powerful. Sometimes strong attraction comes from old wounds, recognizing familiar pain. Sometimes chemistry is actually unresolved trauma meeting itself again. This can be difficult to accept because unhealthy attachment often feels intoxicating. The uncertainty creates obsession. The inconsistency creates emotional craving. The emotional distance creates longing. And the mind mistakes this emotional intensity for soulmate-level connection. But peace rarely feels dramatic to a nervous system addicted to chaos. That is why healing can initially feel strange. Healthier connections may feel calmer, slower, quieter, less emotionally addictive. At first, some people even mistake this peace for lack of passion because their nervous system became conditioned to emotional turbulence. This is another reason karma repeats. The body unconsciously seeks familiar emotional stimulation, even when that stimulation causes suffering. Breaking this cycle requires deep honesty. You must begin asking difficult questions. Why am I attracted to emotional unavailability? Why does inconsistency increase my attachment? Why do I confuse anxiety with love? Why do I keep trying to earn affection instead of receiving it freely? Why do I abandon myself so quickly when afraid of losing connection? These questions are uncomfortable, but they illuminate the hidden patterns controlling emotional life. And illumination changes everything, because what remains unconscious controls you. What becomes conscious can finally begin healing. This is why painful relationships sometimes become spiritual teachers. Not because suffering itself is sacred, but because repeated pain eventually forces awareness. After enough cycles, the soul becomes tired of repeating the same emotional lesson. You stop wanting temporary emotional highs that always end in collapse. You stop romanticizing suffering. You stop chasing people who constantly confuse your spirit. You begin craving peace more than emotional intensity. That shift is profound, because once peace becomes more attractive than chaos, your choices begin changing naturally. You stop entertaining certain behaviors. You stop explaining away emotional neglect. You stop trying to rescue unavailable people. You stop believing love must hurt constantly in order to be meaningful. This is emotional karma beginning to dissolve, not because life suddenly becomes painless, but because awareness interrupts the old unconscious cycle. Buddhist teachings remind us that awareness itself is liberation. The moment you fully see the pattern, part of its power weakens. The wound may still exist. The attachment may still arise. But consciousness has entered the process now, and consciousness changes the future. Before awareness, you repeat patterns automatically. After awareness, you begin choosing differently, slowly, imperfectly, but intentionally. There may still be moments where old attachment patterns return. Healing is rarely perfectly linear. Sometimes the old fears reappear unexpectedly. Sometimes loneliness weakens boundaries. Sometimes familiar emotional chemistry becomes tempting again, but awareness keeps whispering truth. It reminds you what certain patterns cost your peace. It reminds you how many times the same suffering repeated itself. It reminds you how deeply you lost yourself trying to keep unavailable love. And because awareness now exists, the cycle can no longer fully operate in darkness. This is why healing eventually changes attraction itself. As consciousness evolves, you stop feeling emotionally nourished by relationships built on instability. Your spirit becomes more sensitive to peace, honesty, emotional consistency, and mutual care. You begin recognizing that true intimacy does not require constant suffering. You begin understanding that healthy love feels safer, not more confusing. You begin valuing calm over emotional chaos. This is not becoming boring. This is becoming emotionally free. Because emotional freedom is not the absence of love. It is the absence of unconscious suffering repeating endlessly through different people. One of the deepest shifts happens when you stop viewing painful relationships only as proof that others hurt you and begin seeing them as mirrors revealing unresolved wounds inside yourself. This does not excuse harmful behavior. People remain responsible for their actions. But awareness asks a deeper question too. What is this experience teaching me about my own attachment? That question transforms suffering into awakening. Suddenly, every repeated heartbreak becomes information. Every emotional trigger becomes guidance. Every painful pattern becomes an invitation toward greater consciousness. And slowly, the soul begins evolving beyond the old cycle. You stop chasing unavailable people because you finally understand what the chase was feeding emotionally. You stop begging for reassurance because your worth no longer depends entirely on external validation. You stop tolerating confusion because peace has become more valuable than attachment. You stop repeating the same emotional lesson because awareness has finally interrupted the unconscious pattern beneath it. This is the true meaning of healing karmic cycles, not becoming perfect, not never feeling attachment again, but no longer living completely controlled by unconscious emotional wounds. You begin responding with awareness instead of reacting from fear. You begin choosing yourself without needing to stop loving others. You begin recognizing familiar suffering before it completely consumes you again. And perhaps most importantly, you stop blaming life for repeatedly teaching lessons you were unconsciously avoiding. Because sometimes life repeats pain not to punish you, but to awaken you. The lesson returns through different faces until the soul is finally ready to see what it could not see before. And once awareness truly arrives, something beautiful begins happening. The cycle that once felt endless starts losing momentum. You stop recreating the same suffering because you are no longer the same unconscious person participating in it. The old patterns begin dissolving, not through force, not through denial, but through clarity. The clarity to see your wounds without shame. The clarity to recognize attachment without becoming trapped inside it. The clarity to choose peace over familiar pain. And from that clarity, emotional freedom slowly begins to grow. Because the moment awareness interrupts unconscious attachment, karma no longer controls your heart the same way. The cycle finally begins to end. And when awareness finally begins to interrupt the old cycle, the heart faces another difficult lesson. It is not enough to stop repeating the same pain. You must also learn how to release what leaves without letting bitterness become your new prison. Because sometimes, even after the pattern is clear, resentment remains. The person is gone, the lesson is visible, the cycle is weakening, but the heart still holds anger like a burning coal, hoping the other person will somehow feel the heat. There is a kind of freedom that begins when you stop asking life to punish the people who hurt you and start asking your own heart to become light again. At first, blessing what leaves can sound impossible. When someone disappoints you, betrays you, abandons you, misunderstands you, or walks away after receiving your love, the first feeling is rarely gratitude. The first feeling is pain, then confusion, then anger, then the mind begins building its case. It remembers every moment you were patient, every moment you forgave, every moment you stayed when leaving would have been easier, every moment you gave love and did not receive the same care back. And because the pain feels unfair, the heart begins to harden. You may start wishing they would regret losing you. You may want them to feel the same hurt they caused. You may want them to return one day, not because you truly want peace with them, but because you want proof that you mattered. This is very human. When the heart feels wounded, it searches for balance. It wants the pain to make sense. It wants life to say, yes, what happened to you mattered. But Buddhism gently points to a deeper truth. Revenge does not heal the wound. Bitterness does not restore what was lost. Resentment keeps the person alive inside your mind long after they have already left your life. This is why blessing what leaves is not about pretending nothing hurt you. It is not about calling harmful behavior good. It is not about excusing someone's actions or forcing yourself to smile through pain. It is about refusing to let someone's departure turn your heart into a place of poison. That is the real practice. To bless what leaves means to release the demand that the past must become different before you can be free. It means saying, I will not carry hatred just because this ended painfully. It means choosing not to let one chapter of suffering become the emotional climate of your entire life. This is not weakness. It is strength with softness. Many people misunderstand forgiveness and gratitude because they think these words mean surrendering justice. But Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to deny truth. If someone hurt you, they hurt you. If someone lied, they lied. If someone used your kindness, that happened. If someone left without care, that pain was real. Awareness does not erase facts, but awareness asks, How long will you continue drinking the poison of resentment after the event has already happened? Because resentment often feels powerful at first. It gives the ego something to hold. It says, I will not let them get away with this. It says, I will remember everything. It says, I will become cold so nobody can hurt me again. But underneath that hardness, resentment is usually pain that has not found a peaceful place to rest. It keeps the wound fresh. Every time you replay the story, the body responds as if the hurt is happening again. Every time you imagine what you should have said, what they should have done, how they should have suffered, your nervous system returns to the same emotional fire. The person may be absent physically, but resentment keeps inviting them back into your inner world. That is not freedom. That is another form of attachment. This is one of the most subtle truths in Buddhist detachment. You can be attached through love, but you can also be attached through anger. You can cling to someone through longing, but you can also cling to them through resentment. You may tell yourself you are over them, yet your mind still gives them a room inside your thoughts every day. Hatred is not the opposite of attachment. Sometimes it is attachment with fire around it. Blessing what leaves breaks that fire, not immediately, not magically, not by pretending you are above pain. It begins slowly when you become tired of letting the past control your present. You start noticing that your anger is no longer protecting you, it is exhausting you. You realize that the person who left may no longer be thinking about the situation while you are still carrying their shadow inside your chest. That realization can be painful, but it is also powerful, because you begin understanding that release is not something you do for them. It is something you do for your own peace. Gratitude becomes important here, not because everything that happened was pleasant, but because gratitude helps the heart find meaning without needing revenge. It allows you to say, this hurt me, but it also taught me. It allows you to hold both truths at once. The pain was real, and the lesson was real too. This is emotional maturity. A bitter heart says, because it hurt, it had no value. An awakened heart says, because it hurt, I must look carefully at what it revealed. That does not mean you become grateful for mistreatment. No. You become grateful for the awareness that came after it. You become grateful for the self-respect it awakened. You become grateful for the boundary it forced you to build. You become grateful for the clarity that finally arrived. You become grateful that life removed what your attachment might have kept choosing. This kind of gratitude is not soft denial. It is fierce wisdom. It says, I will not waste this pain. When someone leaves, especially after deeply affecting you, the mind often wants to turn the ending into a courtroom. It wants a guilty person, a sentence, a final judgment. It wants to prove who was right and who was wrong. Sometimes this is understandable because clarity matters. But emotional freedom does not always arrive through winning the case in your mind. Sometimes it arrives when you stop needing the case to continue. You do not have to keep arguing with someone's memory to prove that your pain was valid. Your pain is already valid. You know what happened. Your body knows what happened. Your spirit knows what happened. You do not need to rehearse the wound every day to keep the truth alive. There comes a point when repeating the story no longer honors your pain. It traps you inside it. Blessing what leaves means you stop feeding the inner courtroom. You stop calling the past back to testify again and again. You stop letting old conversations become your daily meditation. You stop making revenge your proof of strength. Instead, you begin turning your attention toward peace. This is difficult because peace can feel unfair when you have been hurt. The ego may say, why should I be peaceful when they caused the pain? But peace is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. Peace is the home you return to after suffering has taken you too far away from yourself. And you deserve to return. Buddhist teachings often speak of compassion, but compassion does not mean emotional blindness. Compassion means seeing clearly that people act from their own level of awareness, wounds, fear, ignorance, and conditioning. This does not excuse harm, but it helps you stop personalizing everything as proof of your worthlessness. Some people hurt others because they have not met themselves honestly. Some leave carelessly because they do not know how to face emotional responsibility. Some betray because desire controls them more than wisdom. Some disappear because discomfort terrifies them. Some reject love because they do not know how to receive it without fear. Again, this does not make their actions right, but understanding this can soften the belief that their behavior defines your value. Often, what people do reflects their inner state more than your worth. This understanding is part of blessing what leaves. It allows you to say, may they grow, may they awaken, may they learn what they could not learn with me, and may I be free from carrying their unhealedness as my burden. That is a powerful blessing, not because it invites them back, but because it releases them from the center of your emotional life. There is deep dignity in reaching a point where you no longer need someone to suffer in order for you to heal. This does not mean you want them close. This does not mean you trust them again. This does not mean you forget what happened. It simply means your heart no longer depends on their downfall for peace. That is freedom. Many people delay healing because they believe the other person must first apologize, regret, explain, or return with remorse before they can move on. But this gives your freedom to the very person who hurt you. It means your peace depends on their awareness, and if they never awaken, does that mean you must suffer forever? No. The Buddhist path brings the power back inward. It teaches that your liberation cannot depend entirely on another person's emotional maturity. You may never receive the apology. You may never hear the explanation. You may never see them understand the depth of what they caused, but you can still become free. That freedom begins when you stop waiting for the past to become fair before you allow your heart to soften. This is not easy. The heart may resist. It may say, but they do not deserve my blessing. And perhaps they do not in the ordinary sense. But blessing what leaves is not about what they deserve. It is about what you deserve. You deserve a heart that is not constantly burning. You deserve sleep without rehearsing old pain. You deserve a mind that is not filled with revenge fantasies. You deserve a future not controlled by someone who already left. So the blessing is not for their ego. It is for your release. It can be as simple as saying within yourself, may this person be released from my heart. May I release myself from this story. May the lesson remain, but may the bitterness leave. That small inner sentence can become a doorway, because bitterness often disguises itself as protection. It tells you that if you stay angry, you will never be fooled again. But anger alone does not create wisdom. Awareness does, boundaries do, self-respect does, discernment does. You do not need resentment to protect yourself. You need clarity. A person can be soft and still wise. A person can forgive and still never return. A person can bless what leaves and still keep the door closed. This is important because many people fear that releasing bitterness means becoming vulnerable to the same pain again. But true release does not erase the lesson. It keeps the wisdom and lets go of the poison. That is the balance. Keep the lesson. Release the hatred. Keep the boundary. Release the revenge. Keep the awareness. Release the emotional obsession. This is what makes blessing what leaves such a powerful Buddhist practice. It separates wisdom from resentment. It allows you to grow without becoming cruel. It allows you to heal without becoming numb. It allows you to remember without reopening the wound every day. There is something deeply beautiful about a person who has been hurt but does not become a mirror of the harm they received. They feel the pain. They learn from it. They protect themselves. but they do not let the experience turn their heart into a weapon. That is spiritual strength, because life will give everyone reasons to become bitter. Everyone will be misunderstood at some point. Everyone will lose someone. Everyone will be disappointed by people they trusted. Everyone will meet moments where the heart wants to close. The difference is not whether pain happens. The difference is what pain turns you into. Does it make you more aware or more resentful, more honest or more guarded, more compassionate or more poisoned, more rooted or more reactive? Blessing what leaves is the practice of refusing to let loss deform your spirit. It is choosing to say, "This hurt, but I will not let it make me cruel." That choice may take time. You may not be ready immediately. When the wound is fresh, forcing gratitude can become another form of self-betrayal. You do not need to rush. You do not need to pretend. Real release has stages. First, you may need to grieve. Then you may need to feel anger. Then you may need to understand. Then, slowly, gratitude may become possible. Healthy gratitude cannot be forced before truth is acknowledged. If you try to bless what leaves too early while still denying your pain, the blessing becomes fake. It becomes spiritual performance. But when gratitude grows from honest awareness, it becomes healing. You might begin with something small. I am grateful I now see what I could not see before. I am grateful I survived what I thought would destroy me. I am grateful this ending taught me to stop abandoning myself. I am grateful I no longer have to live inside confusion. I am grateful life removed what I was too attached to release. These are not easy sentences, but they carry power because they shift your energy from victimhood into awakening. Victimhood says, "This happened to me, and now I am ruined." Awakening says, "This happened, it hurt me deeply, but I am still becoming wiser." That difference matters, because resentment often freezes people in the moment of injury. Years may pass, but emotionally they remain standing at the same goodbye, the same betrayal, the same rejection, the same unanswered message, the same broken promise. Their body grows older, but their heart remains trapped in that moment. Blessing what leaves helps time move again inside the soul. It does not erase memory. It releases the emotional grip around memory. One day you may remember the person and no longer feel your whole body tighten. You may hear their name and not feel pulled into the old story. You may pass a place connected to them and feel a gentle sadness instead of a storm. That is healing. Not forgetting, not pretending, but remembering without being imprisoned. This is what gratitude does slowly. It changes the emotional flavor of memory. Resentment makes memory bitter. Gratitude makes memory instructive. Compassion makes memory softer. Awareness makes memory useful. And with time, the person becomes less of a wound and more of a teacher. Not because they were perfect, not because they treated you well, but because your consciousness transformed through the experience. This is how the heart becomes free. One of the most powerful parts of Buddhist practice is learning to wish freedom even for those who could not love you properly. This does not mean inviting them back into your life. Sometimes distance is necessary. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes no contact is wisdom. But internally, you can still release the wish for them to suffer. You can say, "May they be free from the ignorance that made them hurt others. May they learn. May they heal, may they no longer create pain, and may I be free from carrying their actions inside my body." That kind of blessing cleans the heart. It removes the hidden wish to remain connected through anger, because sometimes people refuse to release resentment because resentment is the last emotional tie. If they stop being angry, they fear the connection will truly be over. The anger keeps the person present. It keeps the story alive. It gives the mind something to hold. But healing often requires letting even that final tie dissolve. Not because the person deserves your softness, but because your future deserves your energy. Think of how much life force is lost in resentment. The mental arguments, the emotional rehearsals, the imagined confrontations, the desire to be seen as right, the hope that they will regret everything, the constant checking of whether karma has found them yet. All of this consumes attention that could be used to rebuild your life. Your energy is sacred. Do not keep spending it on someone who has already served their role in your awakening. Bless what leaves means you gather your energy back. You call your mind home. You stop scattering your spirit across old pain. You begin placing your attention where healing can actually happen. This is where gratitude becomes practical, not just spiritual. It helps you reclaim. Focus. Instead of obsessing over what was lost, you begin seeing what remains. Your breath remains. Your body remains. Your future remains. Your capacity to love remains. Your ability to grow remains. Your wisdom remains. The person left, but life did not leave you. That realization is powerful, because when someone important exits your life, it can feel as if everything has ended. But slowly, life begins showing you that space has opened, not empty space only. Sacred space. Space where your peace can return. Space where your identity can rebuild. Space where new understanding can grow. Space where you can finally stop organizing your emotions around someone else's presence. And eventually, gratitude may arise not because you lost them, but because you found yourself afterward. This is one of the hidden gifts of release. You begin understanding that some people had to leave so you could stop living in reaction to them. You had to stop waiting for their mood to determine your day. You had to stop measuring your worth through their attention. You had to stop mistaking emotional tension for love. Their leaving created silence, and inside that silence your soul began returning. That is something worth blessing. Not the wound itself, but the awakening that grew through it. The Buddhist practice of blessing what leaves also teaches humility. It reminds us that we do not always understand the full purpose of a person's role while they are still in our life. Sometimes, while the connection is happening, all we see is desire, hope, attachment, and fear. Only later do we understand the deeper lesson. The person who left may have taught you patience. Another may have taught you boundaries. Another may have taught you that chemistry without peace is dangerous. Another may have taught you to stop ignoring your intuition. Another may have taught you that your kindness must include yourself. When viewed through resentment, all you see is pain. When viewed through awareness, you begin seeing the lesson inside the pain. This does not mean you become grateful for being wounded. It means you become grateful that the wound did not remain meaningless. That is a different thing. Meaning transforms suffering. When pain has no meaning, it becomes bitterness. When pain becomes a teacher, it becomes wisdom. The event may still hurt, but it no longer owns you completely. This is why some of the most peaceful people are not those who were never hurt. They are those who learned how to let pain pass through them without building a home there. They did not become bitter residents of their wounds. They became students of them. And that is what blessing what leaves asks of you. It asks you to become a student of what ended, to ask, what did this teach me about attachment? What did this teach me about my needs? What did this teach me about the kind of love I want to give and receive? What did this teach me about where I still need healing? What did this teach me about letting go? These questions turn endings into wisdom. Without them, endings often become resentment, and resentment blocks the next stage of your life. It keeps your heart suspicious. It makes you punish new people for old wounds. It makes you interpret kindness through fear. It makes you reject tenderness because bitterness says, do not trust anyone again. But wisdom says something different. Wisdom says, trust slowly, see clearly, Keep boundaries, but do not let one ending steal your ability to receive life. This is the middle path, not naive openness, not bitter closure, but conscious softness, a heart that has learned, not hardened. This is what Buddhism quietly points toward: to meet life fully, knowing it will change, to love without clinging, to release without hatred, to grieve without becoming trapped, to remember without poisoning the present. Blessing what leaves is one of the highest forms of emotional maturity because it means you are no longer trying to control the ending. You are no longer demanding that the person return, suffer, explain, or validate your pain before you can be free. You are choosing freedom now, and that choice may begin quietly. Maybe you stop replaying one painful memory. Maybe you stop checking on them. Maybe you stop telling the story in a way that keeps your heart burning. Maybe you stop waiting for karma to prove you were right. Maybe you stop secretly hoping they feel destroyed without you. Maybe you simply breathe and say, "May I be free from this bitterness." That is enough for today. Release is not always one grand moment. Sometimes it is many small moments where you choose not to feed resentment anymore, and over time the heart becomes lighter. You may still remember. You may still feel tenderness. You may still feel sadness sometimes, but the emotional poison begins draining out. The person becomes part of your past, not the ruler of your present. The lesson remains, but the bitterness weakens. This is how gratitude softens resentment. It gives the heart another way to hold the story, not as proof that you were destroyed, not as proof that love is unsafe, not as proof that everyone leaves, but as proof that even painful endings can awaken wisdom, boundaries, strength, compassion, and deeper self-respect. And once you can bless what leaves, you stop being emotionally controlled by departure. People may come, people may go. Some may love you well, some may teach you through pain, some may stay longer than expected, some may leave before you are ready. But your heart begins learning a new way to live. It can open without clinging. It can release without revenge. It can grieve without becoming bitter. It can remember without becoming trapped. That is freedom. Not because nothing hurts anymore, but because pain no longer turns you against life. So if someone has left your life and resentment still rises when you think of them, do not shame yourself. Begin gently. Begin truthfully. Admit the hurt. Honor the wound. See the lesson. Keep the boundary. Then slowly, when your heart is ready, whisper a blessing that is really a release. May you go your way. May I go mine. May the pain become wisdom. May the memory lose its chains. May what left no longer keep me from living. And may my heart become light enough to receive peace again. And perhaps that is why so many people remain trapped inside painful relationships long after the peace has disappeared. Not because they do not see the suffering, but because something inside them fears loneliness even more than emotional pain. The relationship may exhaust them, confuse them, even slowly destroy their spirit. Yet the thought of being alone still feels more frightening than staying attached to what hurts them. And this fear quietly keeps countless people asleep to themselves for years. There is a loneliness that teaches wisdom, and there is a loneliness people spend their entire lives trying to escape. At first, the fear of being alone rarely looks dramatic. It hides inside small decisions. You keep texting someone who drains you because silence feels heavier than disappointment. You remain emotionally attached to someone unavailable because losing the connection feels unbearable. You lower your standards just to keep someone near. You tolerate confusion because emptiness terrifies you more than emotional instability. And slowly, without noticing it, your fear of loneliness becomes stronger than your desire for peace. This is where suffering deepens, because when people are afraid of being alone, they often stop asking whether a connection is healthy. The only question becomes, will this person stay? And once staying becomes more important than truth, attachment begins controlling the relationship. Buddhist teachings explain that many forms of suffering come not from reality itself, but from the desperate attempts to escape uncomfortable inner states. Loneliness is one of those states. Most people are not only afraid of physical solitude, they are afraid of what solitude reveals when distraction disappears. When you are alone long enough, you begin hearing yourself clearly. Your fears become louder, your wounds become visible, your unresolved emotions rise to the surface, your hidden emptiness stops hiding. And for many people this feels overwhelming, so instead of turning inward with awareness, they rush toward attachment. They use relationships as emotional shelter from themselves. They seek constant connection, not because the connection is healthy, but because silence feels unbearable. This is why some people jump from one relationship directly into another without ever healing. The moment loneliness appears, panic begins. They immediately search for a new attachment to numb the discomfort, a new conversation, a new emotional high, a new person to focus on, a new source of validation, not because they are deeply in love, but because they are deeply afraid of sitting alone with their own thoughts, afraid of facing unresolved grief, afraid of feeling unwanted, afraid of confronting the emptiness they have spent years covering with attachment. And because this fear remains unconscious, relationships become emotional anesthesia instead of conscious connection. This is one reason emotionally unhealthy attachments form so easily. A lonely heart will often accept what a peaceful heart would reject. When someone feels emotionally empty inside, even inconsistent affection can feel intoxicating. A little attention feels like salvation. A small amount of validation feels deeply addictive. The person becomes attached not only to the relationship, but to the temporary relief the relationship provides from inner loneliness. But temporary relief is not the same as healing. This is why people can remain deeply unhappy inside relationships and still fear leaving them. The relationship may no longer bring peace, but it still protects them from facing themselves completely alone. And for many people, facing themselves feels terrifying. At night, when the distractions disappear, something uncomfortable begins rising. Old memories, regrets, insecurities, questions about identity, questions about purpose, questions about worth, questions they have avoided for years by keeping themselves emotionally occupied. Attachment becomes distraction. This is one of the most overlooked truths about unhealthy relationships. Sometimes people are not attached to the person alone. They are attached to the escape from loneliness the person provides. The relationship becomes a shield, protecting them from inner confrontation, and because of this, they stay emotionally asleep. Buddhist wisdom teaches that awakening often begins in silence, solitude, and honest self-observation. But many people fear silence because silence removes distraction. Without constant emotional stimulation, the mind begins revealing what has been buried underneath activity and attachment. This is why solitude feels uncomfortable at first. You can no longer run. You can no longer hide inside someone else's attention. You can no longer organize your identity entirely around being needed, chosen, desired, or loved. You must finally meet yourself directly, and that meeting changes everything. But before transformation comes discomfort. A person who fears loneliness will often tolerate emotionally unhealthy dynamics simply to avoid the emptiness of being alone. They may stay with someone emotionally unavailable because occasional affection feels better than silence. They may accept disrespect because rejection feels more frightening than pain. They may keep chasing relationships that clearly drain them because the temporary emotional connection helps them avoid confronting deeper wounds. This creates spiritual sleep, not because they are weak, but because fear controls their choices more than awareness does. A spiritually asleep person often measures their worth through connection. If someone wants them, they feel valuable. If someone leaves, they feel empty. Their emotional state constantly rises and falls, depending on external attachment. They have never fully built an inner relationship with themselves strong enough to remain stable without constant emotional validation. This is why loneliness feels unbearable to them. Without external attention, they do not know how to feel emotionally anchored, so they keep attaching again and again, even when the relationships hurt them, even when peace disappears, even when intuition quietly whispers that something is wrong, because loneliness feels bigger than wisdom. At first, one of the saddest things about fear-driven attachment is how much suffering people willingly accept just to avoid solitude. They remain in relationships that shrink them emotionally. They stay around people who constantly confuse them. They overextend themselves trying to maintain emotional closeness with people who give very little in return. And when others ask why they stay, they often do not fully understand the answer themselves. The conscious mind says, "I love them." But sometimes the deeper truth is, "I do not know how to be alone with myself." That truth is painful to face because it reveals how much identity became dependent on attachment. Many people build their emotional life entirely around relationships. Their sense of worth, purpose, routine, emotional safety, and identity all become tied to another person's presence. So when solitude appears, it feels like collapse. Not because solitude is inherently terrible, but because they never learned how to emotionally exist without constant external reinforcement. This is why loneliness becomes such a powerful spiritual teacher when people finally stop running from it. At first, loneliness feels empty, then painful, then revealing, then transformative. But most people never stay long enough to reach the transformation because they escape too quickly into another attachment. Buddhism teaches that suffering often continues because people keep running from the very experiences capable of awakening them. Loneliness is one of those experiences. When faced consciously, loneliness reveals hidden attachments, emotional dependency, fear of abandonment, lack of self-worth, and unresolved grief. But if you immediately numb loneliness through unhealthy attachment, the lesson remains unfinished, so the cycle repeats. Another relationship, another attachment, another emotional dependency, another painful ending, another attempt to escape yourself, and the suffering continues because the root wound still remains untouched. This is why emotional independence matters so deeply. Emotional independence does not mean isolation. It does not mean you stop loving people or needing connection. Human beings naturally need connection. But emotional independence means your entire identity no longer collapses when alone. Your worth no longer disappears without external attention. Your peace no longer depends completely on another person's presence. That kind of stability changes relationships profoundly, because once you are no longer terrified of being alone, you stop accepting unhealthy attachments out of desperation. You stop chasing unavailable people. You stop begging for consistency. You stop tolerating confusion simply because silence scares you. You begin choosing relationships from awareness instead of fear. That shift changes everything. Many people do not realize how much fear controls their romantic decisions. They think they are following love, but often they are following emotional panic. The panic says, "Do not lose this person. Do not end up alone. Do not face the emptiness again. Do whatever it takes to keep the connection alive." And under that pressure, people betray themselves repeatedly. They ignore red flags. They silence boundaries. They overgive. They tolerate emotional neglect. They abandon intuition. All because loneliness feels unbearable, This is why fear of being alone keeps people spiritually asleep. It traps consciousness inside survival mode. Instead of asking, what truly nourishes my spirit, people ask, what helps me avoid emptiness right now? Those are very different questions. One leads toward awakening. The other often leads toward attachment and repetition. There is also a deeper cultural reason many people fear loneliness. Society constantly teaches that being alone means something is wrong with you. People are praised for being desired, chosen, pursued, married, partnered, surrounded. Solitude is often portrayed as failure instead of transformation. Because of this conditioning, many people rush into attachments simply to escape the emotional shame of being alone. They think, at least someone wants me, even if the relationship brings anxiety, even if the connection lacks peace, even if they feel emotionally unseen. Being chosen temporarily feels better than facing inner emptiness. But Buddhist wisdom points toward a radical truth. Loneliness is not always punishment. Sometimes loneliness is preparation. Sometimes it is the sacred space where your spirit finally learns how to stand without leaning completely on another person. That lesson is life-changing, because a person who can sit peacefully with themselves becomes far less vulnerable to unhealthy attachment. They no longer enter relationships starving for validation. They no longer treat love as emotional survival. They no longer accept emotional crumbs simply because they fear emptiness. They choose more consciously. They love more freely. They leave more wisely. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves just to avoid being abandoned by others. This is the awakening hidden inside solitude. But reaching this awakening requires courage, because the first stage of loneliness often feels brutal. You sit alone, and suddenly every unresolved feeling becomes louder. Memories return, regret appears, fear surfaces, questions about identity rise up. The mind wants distraction immediately. This is why many people cannot sit quietly for long. Silence exposes what constant stimulation hides. Yet within that same silence, self-awareness begins growing. You begin noticing your emotional habits. You begin noticing how much external attention controlled your mood. You begin noticing how quickly you seek attachment whenever discomfort appears. You begin noticing how often you avoided yourself through emotional dependence. This awareness is uncomfortable, but it is sacred. Because what you can finally see clearly, you can eventually begin healing. One reason loneliness becomes transformative is because it slowly teaches you how to become emotionally present with yourself. At first, you may hate your own company because you are unfamiliar with it. Your whole life may have revolved around seeking emotional reassurance from outside yourself. So when alone, your mind immediately searches for distraction. But over time, if you stay present instead of running, something begins shifting. You start listening to yourself differently. You start noticing your real emotional needs. You start reconnecting with forgotten parts of your identity. You start learning that your worth exists, even in silence. This changes relationships profoundly, because now you no longer enter connection from desperation. You enter from wholeness. A whole person can still feel lonely sometimes. Loneliness itself is part of being human, but there is a difference between natural loneliness and fear-driven attachment. Natural loneliness simply reminds us that humans desire connection. Fear-driven attachment says, I must have someone immediately, even if the connection destroys my peace. That difference matters deeply. Buddhist teachings do not ask you to reject relationships. They ask you to stop using relationships as escape from yourself. This is why spiritually asleep people often become addicted to emotional intensity. Intensity distracts them from inner emptiness temporarily. The excitement, uncertainty, longing, drama, obsession, and emotional highs keep the mind occupied. But once the intensity fades, the unresolved loneliness underneath returns stronger than before. So they chase intensity again, another attachment, another emotional distraction, another temporary escape. Meanwhile, the deeper wound remains untouched. A spiritually awake person begins approaching relationships differently. They still love, they still connect, they still feel deeply, but they no longer expect another human being to permanently rescue them from themselves. They understand that no relationship can replace inner awareness, self-respect, and emotional grounding. This understanding creates healthier love. Because now relationships become additions to life, not replacements for inner stability. You stop expecting one person to carry the full weight of your identity. You stop expecting constant attention to heal your wounds. You stop expecting attachment to eliminate loneliness permanently. Instead, you begin building a peaceful relationship with your own inner world. That relationship becomes your foundation. And from that foundation, connection feels very different. You no longer cling as desperately. You no longer panic every time someone becomes distant. You no longer tolerate emotional confusion simply to avoid being alone. You no longer lose your entire sense of self inside relationships. This is emotional maturity beginning to grow. One of the deepest fears underneath unhealthy attachment is the belief that being alone means being unlovable. Many people secretly believe their value depends on whether someone chooses them romantically, so when alone, shame rises quickly. They feel invisible, unwanted, forgotten. This is why they rush into relationships even when their spirit knows the connection is unhealthy. Being chosen feels emotionally safer than sitting alone with the fear of not being enough. But healing requires challenging this illusion directly. Your worth does not disappear in solitude. Your lovability does not depend on constant romantic validation. Your existence remains meaningful even when no one is currently choosing you. These truths sound simple, but emotionally they can feel revolutionary for someone who built their identity entirely around attachment. This is why solitude can become sacred. Solitude slowly separates your worth from external attention. It teaches you to exist without constantly performing for love. It teaches you how to sit with yourself honestly. It teaches you that peace is possible even without constant emotional stimulation. And eventually, something beautiful begins happening. The loneliness that once terrified you starts transforming into space. Space to breathe, space to heal, space to think clearly, space to reconnect with your own spirit, space to stop living in reaction to someone else's moods, space to remember who you are outside attachment. This transformation changes the soul deeply, because once you stop fearing loneliness so intensely, unhealthy attachments lose much of their power over you. People can no longer manipulate you through distance so easily. You stop clinging desperately to anyone who gives temporary attention. You stop treating relationships as emergency medicine for inner emptiness. Instead, connection becomes something freer, more conscious, more peaceful, more honest. This does not mean you never feel lonely again. Even awakened people experience loneliness sometimes, but loneliness no longer controls their decisions completely. They can sit with discomfort without immediately abandoning themselves to escape it. That ability changes everything. Because many painful relationships survive only because one or both people are terrified of solitude. Remove the fear of being alone, and suddenly the unhealthy attachment loses much of its grip. The confusion becomes easier to leave. The emotional manipulation becomes easier to recognize. The overgiving becomes easier to stop. Fear no longer dominates awareness. This is spiritual awakening in action, not becoming emotionally detached from humanity, but becoming free enough internally that fear no longer forces you into self-betrayal. There is tremendous peace in reaching the point where being alone no longer feels like emotional death. You begin understanding that solitude can nourish the soul when approached consciously. You begin enjoying your own company more. You begin creating a life rooted in your values, your peace, your creativity, your healing, your awareness. And from that place, relationships become healthier naturally because they are no longer built entirely on emotional desperation. You choose people because there is mutual peace, not because silence terrifies you. You stay because there is honesty, not because loneliness feels unbearable. You love because your heart is open, not because your wounds are starving for validation. This is what awakening slowly creates. A person who no longer fears being alone becomes much harder to emotionally manipulate. They stop accepting unhealthy love simply because it is available. They stop settling for emotional crumbs. They stop shrinking themselves to maintain attachment. They begin protecting their spirit differently, not through walls, but through awareness. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson loneliness teaches when finally faced honestly. The emptiness you feared was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to introduce you to yourself. Beneath the silence, beneath the discomfort, beneath the fear, your real self has been waiting patiently for your attention. Not the self built around attachment, not the self addicted to validation, not the self constantly chasing emotional reassurance, but the quieter self underneath all of it. The self that can breathe without being chosen, the self that remains worthy in solitude, the self that does not disappear when relationships end, the self that has always existed beneath fear. And once you truly meet that self, something extraordinary happens. You stop needing unhealthy attachment to feel alive. You stop treating loneliness like a monster. You stop running from silence. You stop abandoning yourself just to avoid emptiness. Because you finally understand something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Being alone is not the deepest human fear. Being disconnected from yourself is. Some people were never meant to stay forever. They came into your life to expose the wounds you could no longer ignore, to break the attachments that were keeping you emotionally asleep, and to awaken the version of you that could finally choose peace over fear. Through every goodbye, every rejection, every season that ended, life was not trying to destroy you. It was trying to return you to yourself. Tonight you learned that not every deep connection is meant to last forever. Some people are temporary teachers. Some are mirrors. Some arrive to reveal your loneliness, your attachment, your fear of abandonment, and your habit of losing yourself just to be loved. But you also discovered something deeper. Healing begins the moment you stop measuring your worth through who stays and who leaves. Detachment is not becoming cold. It is learning how to love without destroying your own peace. It is understanding that endings are not always punishments. Sometimes they are awakenings disguised as heartbreak. And maybe the people who left your life did not ruin your story. Maybe they redirected it toward the version of you that was waiting to be found all along. Before you leave tonight, I want you to pause for a moment and ask yourself something honestly. Which person awakened you the most through pain, loss, or rejection? And what lesson did they leave behind inside your soul? Share your answer in the comments. Someone reading it may realize they are not alone in their healing. And if these teachings touched something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us. There are still many awakenings ahead, and your next season of peace may be closer than you think.